The moment he spoke those words, my entire world shattered. Time seemed to slow, and I could feel each piece of my heart breaking in painful succession. "Your son isn't mine." 5 words. Just 5 simple words that destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life. I stood there in our kitchen, clutching the edge of the granite countertop so tightly my knuckles turned white. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting shadows that suddenly felt too harsh, too revealing. Thomas stood across from me, his face a mask of cold indifference I'd never seen before. This was the man I'd loved for 7 years, the man I'd built a life with, the father of my child, our beautiful 3-year-old son, Ethan, who was thankfully napping upstairs, blissfully unaware that his father was denying his existence. "What did you just say?" My voice came out as a whisper, shaking with disbelief. "You heard me, Rebecca." His eyes were devoid of the warmth I'd once found comfort in. "I've suspected for a while. I finally did the test. He's not mine." I felt dizzy, the room spinning around me. That's impossible, Thomas. You know that's impossible." But his face remained impassive, unmoved by my shock or the tears now sliding down my cheeks. The suitcases by the door suddenly made terrifying sense. This wasn't just another business trip. He was leaving us. "I can't do this anymore," he continued, his voice flat, emotionless. "Pretending to be a father to someone else's kid while you—" "Don't you dare finish that sentence." Something inside me snapped. "Ethan is yours. I have never, not once—" "Save it." He cut me off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "The papers are on the table. My lawyer will be in touch." And just like that, he picked up his suitcases, walked to the door, and left our life without so much as a backward glance. No goodbye to his son. No explanation that made any sense. Just an accusation that was biologically impossible and emotionally devastating. I collapsed onto the kitchen floor, my body racked with silent sobs. I couldn't scream or wail. Ethan was sleeping upstairs, and even in my shattered state, protecting my son came first. Our son. Thomas's son, no matter what twisted lie he'd convinced himself of. Through tear-blurred eyes, I looked at the manila envelope on our dining table. Divorce papers. My hands trembled as I pulled them out, scanning the cold, legal language that reduced our 7 years together to property divisions and custody arrangements. Or rather, the complete abandonment of custody. Thomas was relinquishing all parental rights. He wanted nothing to do with Ethan. How could he do this? How could he just decide that the child we'd made together, the boy who had his eyes, his dimpled smile, wasn't his? It wasn't just scientifically impossible. I had never been with anyone else. It was emotionally unfathomable. I remembered the night Ethan was conceived, our anniversary weekend at that little bed and breakfast in Vermont. The way Thomas had looked at me in the firelight, telling me he couldn't wait to start a family. The joy in his eyes 9 months later when he held our son for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "He's perfect, Becca. He's absolutely perfect." And now, 3 years later, he was gone, claiming our perfect boy wasn't his, leaving me alone with a broken heart and a sleeping toddler who would soon wake up asking for a daddy who had just erased him from his life. I don't know how long I sat there on the kitchen floor, but eventually, the baby monitor crackled with the sounds of Ethan stirring from his nap. I pulled myself up, splashed cold water on my face, and took several deep breaths. I couldn't let Ethan see me like this. I had to be strong for him now. I was all he had left. "Mama?" His little voice called as I entered his room. He was sitting up in his toddler bed, hair tousled from sleep, Thomas's blue eyes blinking up at me. "Hi, sweetheart." My voice cracked despite my best efforts. "Where Daddy?" He looked past me toward the doorway, expecting Thomas to appear as he often did after Ethan's naps. And in that moment, I made a decision. A decision born of pain and anger and the fierce protective love of a mother. "Daddy had to go away for work, honey." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but it was kinder than the truth. "He'll be gone for a while." "Oh." His little face fell momentarily before brightening again with the resilience of childhood. "Can we have cookies?" "Yes, baby." I gathered him into my arms, breathing in his sweet scent, feeling his solid warmth against my chest. "We can have cookies. And then maybe we'll call Grandma, okay?" As we descended the stairs, the divorce papers still splayed across the dining table, I felt something new unfurling alongside my grief, something hard and determined. Thomas hadn't just left me, he had abandoned our son, discarded him as if Ethan were nothing more than an inconvenient fiction. And for that, I couldn't forgive him. I didn't understand what had driven Thomas to this madness, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Ethan was his son, and someday Thomas would regret what he'd done today. I would make sure of it. But first, I had to survive. The next few weeks passed in a blur of lawyer meetings, sleepless nights, and maintaining a brave face for Ethan. My mother moved in temporarily to help, her face lined with worry and righteous anger on my behalf. "He's gone completely mad," she said one night after we'd finally gotten Ethan to bed. "Anyone with eyes can see that boy is his. The paternity test must have been mixed up or tampered with." I nodded numbly, staring into my untouched glass of wine. I'd thought the same thing initially, demanded to see the test results Thomas claimed to have. But he refused, and his lawyer stonewalled every attempt I made to understand what was happening. "It doesn't matter," I said quietly. "He's made his choice, Mom. He wants nothing to do with us." "And you're just going to accept that?" My mother looked at me incredulously. "Rebecca, you need to fight this. For Ethan's sake." "Fight what? He's abandoned us. Signed away his parental rights? What am I supposed to do? Force him to be a father when he clearly doesn't want to be?" The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm just saying that something isn't right here. The Thomas we knew wouldn't do this." But that was just it. The Thomas we knew wouldn't do this, which meant the Thomas we knew had never really existed. It had all been a lie. Later that night, after my mother had gone to bed, I sat in the dark of my home office, a place where Thomas and I had once shared dreams of the future. I opened my laptop and typed his name into the search bar, something I'd been avoiding doing since he left. The results were shocking. Thomas had been promoted, CFO of Jensen Financial, a position he'd been angling for when we were still together. There was a photo of him at some charity gala just 3 days ago, smiling broadly, his arm around a willowy blonde I recognized as his colleague, Victoria. My stomach churned. Had he been having an affair? Was that why he'd concocted this ridiculous paternity denial to justify leaving me for her? I clicked through more photos, each one a fresh wound. Thomas looking happier than I'd seen him in months, Victoria gazing up at him adoringly, both of them seemingly without a care in the world. While I was here, picking up the pieces of our shattered life, explaining to our 3-year-old why Daddy didn't come home anymore, Thomas was living his best life with his new woman and his fancy promotion. Something dark and furious unfurled in my chest. This wasn't just about a man leaving his wife. People fell out of love. Marriages ended. This was about a father denying his child, erasing him, acting as if these past 3 years of bedtime stories and first steps and "Daddy, look at me" had never happened. I slammed the laptop shut and pressed my fists against my eyes, trying to stem the fresh wave of tears. I was so tired of crying. "Rebecca?" My mother's soft voice came from the doorway. "Are you all right?" I heard something. I lowered my hands and looked at her, suddenly calm in a way I hadn't been since Thomas left. "I'm going to be," I said quietly, "but I need to make some changes." The first change was practical. I needed to support Ethan on my own now. Before Ethan was born, I'd been an environmental lawyer with a promising career at a prestigious firm. I'd scaled back to part-time after his birth, with Thomas's full support. "We don't need the money," he'd insisted. "And nothing's more important than you being there for our son." Our son. The memory made me sick now. I called my old firm the next day, explaining my situation in the vaguest terms possible. To my relief, they were more than happy to have me back full-time. "Your work was always exceptional, Rebecca," my former supervisor said. "We've missed your expertise." The second change was personal. I sold the house, our house, that Thomas and I had lovingly restored together. I couldn't bear to live surrounded by memories of our former life, seeing his absence in every room. With the proceeds and my renewed salary, I purchased a smaller but comfortable townhouse closer to my office and Ethan's preschool. Moving day was harder than I expected. Ethan stood in his empty bedroom, lower lip trembling. "But where will Daddy find us when he comes back from his work trip?" he asked, and my heart shattered all over again. I knelt down to his level, taking his little hands in mine. "Sweetie, I need to tell you something important," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Daddy isn't coming back. He's decided to live somewhere else now." His blue eyes, Thomas's eyes, filled with tears. Is it because I was bad? No. I pulled him into a fierce hug, my own eyes burning. "No, baby, absolutely not. You are perfect. This is about grown-up things that have nothing to do with you." "Daddy," I swallowed hard. Daddy made some choices that aren't fair or right, but I promise you, this is not your fault. He cried against my shoulder, his little body shaking, and I held him through it, murmuring reassurances and fighting back my own tears. When he finally calmed, hiccuping softly, I pulled back to look at him. But you know what? You and me, we're going to be okay. We're a team, right? He nodded, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. Team Ethan and Mommy. That's right. I managed to smile. And our new house is going to be awesome. You'll see. The third change was the hardest. I had to tell our friends and family what had happened. Thomas had apparently been spreading his own version of events, vague implications that our marriage had fallen apart due to irreconcilable differences. He never directly accused me of infidelity to our mutual friends, but his sudden abandonment of fatherhood spoke volumes. Most of our friends were shocked and supportive, but a few, mainly Thomas's colleagues and golf buddies, distanced themselves, clearly having chosen their side. It hurt more than I expected, these secondary betrayals. Through it all, I maintained a dignified silence about Thomas's paternity denial, partly to protect Ethan from eventually hearing such painful gossip, and partly because I couldn't bear the pitying looks or well-meaning but useless advice. Why don't you get another paternity test? As if I needed proof of what I already knew with absolute certainty. Instead, I focused on rebuilding our lives. I threw myself into my work, excelling in cases I genuinely cared about. I created a warm, stable home for Ethan filled with love and laughter. I started therapy to process my anger and grief. On the surface, we were healing, moving forward. But late at night, when Ethan was asleep and the house was quiet, the rage would return. I'd scroll through social media, seeing Thomas's charmed new life unfold. The official announcement of his relationship with Victoria, their vacation in the Maldives, his further promotion to CEO of a Jensen financial subsidiary. Meanwhile, the child support he'd been legally obligated to pay despite terminating his parental rights often came late, sometimes requiring intervention from my lawyer. It wasn't about the money, I was doing well enough on my own, but the principle of it. The casual disregard for the son he'd abandoned. 6 months after Thomas left, I received an unexpected call from Melissa, his younger sister. We'd always been close, even before Thomas and I got together. She'd been traveling abroad when everything fell apart and had only recently returned. "Can we meet?" she asked, her voice tight with emotion. "I just heard. I can't believe. I need to see you and Ethan." We arranged to meet at a park near my new place. When she saw us, she burst into tears and hugged me fiercely, then knelt to embrace Ethan, who regarded his aunt with shy confusion. It had been too long since he'd seen her. "He looks more like Thomas every day," she whispered as we sat on a bench, watching Ethan play on the slides. "I don't understand how my brother can deny it, or why he would want to." I sighed, watching my son's carefree movements. "I've stopped trying to understand, Mel. It just makes me crazy going in circles." She was quiet for a moment, seeming to wrestle with something. Finally, she turned to me, her expression grave. "There's something you should know. Thomas told our parents that he had a paternity test done, and that's why he left. But when I asked him about it directly, he just changed the subject. Wouldn't look me in the eye." My heart rate accelerated. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't think there ever was a test, Becca." She glanced at Ethan, then back to me. "I think he made it up as an excuse to leave. For Victoria." I felt dizzy, the playground spinning around me. But why would he go that far? Why not just say he'd fallen for someone else? Why deny his own child? Melissa's eyes filled with tears. "Money, status, image. Take your pick. The prenup you signed had a fidelity clause, remember? If he cheated, you'd get half of everything, including his Jensen financial shares. This way, he painted you as the one who'd been unfaithful. And ... She hesitated. "And what?" I prompted, my voice hollow. "Victoria's father is on the board at Jensen. Thomas's rise hasn't been entirely based on merit, if you know what I mean. A messy divorce where he was the cheater wouldn't look good." The rage that had been simmering for months suddenly boiled over. Thomas hadn't just abandoned us. He'd calculated it, crafted a narrative that protected his assets and reputation while destroying mine, used our son as a pawn in his corporate chess game. "I'm so sorry, Becca." Melissa gripped my hand. "I wanted you to know the truth. And to tell you that Mom, Dad, and I don't believe him for a second. We want to be in Ethan's life if you'll let us." I nodded numbly, watching my son, Thomas's son, laugh as he went down the slide. In that moment, something crystallized within me. A plan began to take shape, vague at first, but with a clarity of purpose that took my breath away. Thomas had taken everything from us for the sake of his ambition. His career, his reputation, his success, these were what he valued above his own flesh and blood, above basic human decency. Fine. If that's what mattered to him, then that's where I would hit him. Not now, not yet. But someday, when he least expected it, when he thought himself invincible, I would reveal the truth and watch his carefully constructed world crumble. Becca? Melissa was watching me with concern. Are you okay? I turned to her, a calm smile settling on my face. Yes, I think I finally am. Years passed. Ethan grew from a confused, heartbroken toddler into a bright, resilient young boy. He stopped asking about his father after a while, which both relieved and saddened me. Thomas's parents and Melissa remained in our lives, careful never to speak ill of Thomas in Ethan's presence, but making it clear to me that they believed he had made an unforgivable choice. I excelled in my career, eventually making partner at my firm. I dated occasionally, but never seriously. I had Ethan and my work, and that seemed enough. Thomas and Victoria married in a lavish ceremony featured in several business magazines. He continued his meteoric rise through the corporate world, leveraging his position at Jensen Financial to make connections and build his reputation as a financial wunderkind. Our paths rarely crossed. Albany was big enough that we moved in different circles, and Thomas seemed content to pretend we, or at least Ethan, didn't exist. Child support payments continued, impersonal transactions processed by his accounting team. Once a year, I'd receive corporate Christmas cards signed by his assistant, addressed only to me as if Ethan were a ghost. By the time Ethan was 8, the initial shock and pain had dulled to a persistent ache. We had our routines, our small but loving circle of friends and family, our comfortable life. But I never forgot, never stopped watching Thomas's career from afar. Never abandoned the seed of a plan that had taken root that day in the park. It wasn't until Ethan turned 10 that the opportunity I'd been waiting for finally presented itself. I was preparing a case against Northvale Industries, a chemical company that had been illegally dumping toxic waste, contaminating groundwater in several low-income communities. During my research, I discovered something interesting. Jensen Financial was Northvale's primary investor, with Thomas personally overseeing the relationship. Further digging revealed that Thomas had signed off on reports indicating he'd performed due diligence on Northvale's environmental compliance. Reports that either showed his incompetence or, more likely, his willingness to overlook criminal negligence for the sake of profit. For the first time in years, I felt that familiar surge of righteous anger. Here was Thomas, once again prioritizing money and status over basic human decency, over the health and lives of families not so different from the one he'd abandoned. I took the case to trial and won a landmark judgment against Northvale. The company's stock plummeted, and Jensen Financial took a significant hit. In my closing arguments, I had been careful to name names, including Thomas's, ensuring his complicity was part of the public record. The day after the verdict, I received a text from an unknown number. Was this really necessary? Leave the past in the past. I didn't dignify it with a response. It wasn't about the past. It was about justice. And it was just the beginning. That night, as I tucked Ethan into bed, a ritual he claimed to be too old for but still secretly enjoyed, he looked up at me with those familiar blue eyes and asked a question that caught me off guard. "Mom, why did you decide to be an environmental lawyer?" I sat on the edge of his bed, considering my answer. Because I believe in fighting for what's right, especially for people who can't fight for themselves. Why do you ask? He shrugged, picking at a loose thread on his comforter. I was thinking about what I want to do when I grow up. I think I want to help people too. Pride swelled in my chest. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, Ethan was growing into a thoughtful, compassionate young man. You'd be great at that, sweetheart. Whatever you choose to do. I was thinking maybe business, he continued, like running a company that does good things instead of bad ones. Is that stupid? I leaned down and kissed his forehead, my mind racing ahead to possibilities I'd never considered. Not stupid at all. I think that's brilliant. After Ethan fell asleep, I sat in my home office, nursing a glass of wine and contemplating this new direction. My initial plan had been simple, if long-term, build enough evidence of Thomas's ethical lapses to eventually expose him publicly, damaging his precious reputation and career. But now, a more elegant solution presented itself. What if, instead of simply tearing Thomas down, I built Ethan up? What if my son could achieve everything his father had, but with integrity and purpose? And what if, someday, their paths crossed in the corporate world Thomas so valued, with Ethan never knowing the man he was dealing with was his biological father? The thought made me smile for the first time in years when thinking about Thomas. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, yes, but also about reclaiming the narrative, about transforming pain into purpose. The next day, I enrolled Ethan in a summer business camp for gifted children. It was the first step in a journey that would span the next decade, a journey I would guide with patience, determination, and the cold clarity that comes from having been deeply wronged. By the time Ethan turned 13, he'd developed a genuine passion for business and social entrepreneurship. He was a natural leader, charismatic and thoughtful, with an instinctive understanding of people that I recognized from the better parts of his father. I nurtured these qualities while teaching him the values Thomas lacked: empathy, integrity, and the understanding that true success wasn't measured by wealth or status, but by positive impact. When Ethan was 14, he came home from school one day with a surprising request. "Mom, I've been thinking about my last name," he said, setting his backpack down at our kitchen table. "I know we've always been Ethan and Rebecca Palmer, but that's Dad's name, right? The dad who left?" My heart contracted painfully. We rarely spoke of Thomas directly, though Ethan knew the basic outline, that his father had left us when he was 3, choosing a different life over his family. "Yes," I said carefully. "Palmer is your father's surname." Ethan nodded, his expression serious beyond his years. "I've been thinking maybe I should change it to Wilson, like Grandma and Grandpa. Your maiden name." I sat down across from him, studying his face, so much like Thomas's, yet softer, kinder. "That's a big decision, sweetheart. Can I ask why?" He met my gaze steadily. "Because I'm not his." "Not really. I'm yours. And Grandma and Grandpa Wilson's and Aunt Melissa's. We're a family, and he's not part of it. I don't want to carry his name anymore." Tears pricked at my eyes, but they weren't entirely from sadness. There was pride there, too, and a fierce love for this remarkable boy who'd survived abandonment and emerged stronger. "If that's what you want, we can talk to a lawyer about making it official," I told him. "But I want you to be sure." "I am sure, Mom." His voice was firm. "I want to be Ethan Wilson." We made the change legal before his 15th birthday. I didn't inform Thomas. The minimal legal obligation for child support was still being fulfilled, and beyond that, he'd chosen to have no role in Ethan's life. He had no say in what name our son carried. The name change marked a turning point. Ethan seemed to stand taller afterward, more confident in his identity. He threw himself into his studies with renewed purpose, particularly excelling in business, economics, and computer science. By 16, he was dual-enrolled in high school and college courses, his ambition matching his intelligence. It was around this time that I met James, a fellow environmental attorney who'd recently moved to Albany. We started as colleagues, became friends, and eventually, tentatively, something more. He was kind, steady, and genuinely interested in Ethan's life and accomplishments. "He's an incredible kid," James told me after attending one of Ethan's debate competitions. "You've done an amazing job raising him, Rebecca." "He makes it easy," I replied, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. Single parenthood was never easy, especially with a child who'd experienced such profound abandonment. James became a regular presence in our lives, never trying to replace the father Ethan had lost, but offering male guidance and friendship that I realized my son had been missing. Watching them work on cars together or discuss the ethics of artificial intelligence over dinner, I felt a warmth I'd thought I'd never experience again. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, James and I sat on my back porch, sharing a bottle of wine and watching fireflies illuminate the summer darkness. "I've been offered a position in New York City," he said quietly. "A partnership at Caldwell Environmental Law." My heart sank. "That's a wonderful opportunity. When would you leave?" He turned to face me, his expression serious. "That depends on you and Ethan. Because I'd like you both to consider coming with me." I stared at him, stunned. "James, we can't just uproot our lives. Ethan's in school, I have my practice here." "I know it's a lot to ask," he acknowledged. "But think about it. The opportunities for Ethan in New York would be incredible. Columbia, NYU, the best internships in the country. And you. Any firm in the city would be lucky to have you. Or we could start something together." I didn't answer immediately, my mind racing ahead. James was right about the opportunities for Ethan. And if I was honest with myself, Albany had always felt like a holding pattern, a place where we'd rebuilt our lives but never truly thrived. "I'd need to talk to Ethan," I said finally. This would have to be his decision too. To my surprise, Ethan was immediately enthusiastic about the prospect of moving to New York. Mom, do you know how many tech startups are based there? And the business schools? This could be perfect! And so, 17 years after Thomas walked out of our lives, Ethan and I, along with James, moved to New York City. I couldn't help but feel we were finally stepping fully into our future, leaving behind the shadows of the past. Or so I thought, until 3 months after our move, when I literally collided with Thomas on a busy Manhattan sidewalk. Rebecca, his voice hadn't changed, though the rest of him had. More silver at his temples, lines around his eyes, an expensive suit that screamed corporate success. Thomas. I was proud of how steady my voice remained, even as adrenaline coursed through my system. What a surprise! He glanced at the building behind me, the offices of the environmental law firm where James and I had indeed started our own practice. I heard you'd moved to the city. Doing well, it seems. Very well, I confirmed, resisting the urge to ask how he'd heard about our move. And you? Still with Jensen Financial? A smug smile crossed his face. CEO as of last month, actually. The main company, not just the subsidiary. Congratulations. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. I glanced at my watch, desperate to end this unexpected encounter. I should get going. I have a meeting. As I moved to step past him, he caught my arm, his touch sending an unexpected jolt of revulsion through me. How is he? The question was barely audible. I stared at him, momentarily speechless. 17 years of absence, and now he had the audacity to ask after the son he'd denied? Ethan is exceptional, I said finally, my voice cold. No thanks to you. I pulled my arm from his grasp and walked away, my heart pounding. As soon as I was around the corner, I ducked into a coffee shop and called James, my hands shaking as I recounted the encounter. Do you think it was a coincidence? James asked, his voice concerned. I don't know. I watched pedestrians stream past the window, suddenly feeling exposed. But I don't like it. And I don't want him anywhere near Ethan. Does Ethan even know what he looks like? Would he recognize Thomas if they met? I considered this. Ethan had seen photos of Thomas when he was younger, family pictures I hadn't had the heart to destroy completely, but he might not recognize the middle-aged version. I'm not sure, I admitted, but I don't want to find out. That night I sat Ethan down and told him about the encounter, framing it as a heads-up rather than a cause for alarm. At 17, he deserved honesty, so he's here in New York, Ethan said thoughtfully, and he's the CEO of Jensen Financial now. I nodded, watching him carefully. Does that bother you? He considered the question, his expression serious. Not bother exactly. It's just strange to think he's a real person walking around the same city, you know. All these years, he's been more of an idea than a person. His maturity struck me anew. I just wanted you to know in case you ever run into him. Though New York is a big city, Ethan nodded, then asked the question I'd been dreading. Do you think he'll try to contact me now that we're here? I don't know, I answered honestly. But whatever happens, it's your choice whether to engage. You don't owe him anything, Ethan. My son smiled then, a smile so reminiscent of the man we were discussing that it made my heart ache. I know, Mom. But I've been thinking... He hesitated. Maybe someday I might want to meet him. Not now, but when I'm established in my own right. Just to see? I swallowed hard. That would be your decision. And I'd support you whatever you choose. The conversation shifted to other topics, but Thomas's sudden reappearance in our periphery had changed something. A door had been cracked open that I'd thought permanently sealed. That night, unable to sleep, I revisited the plan I'd been cultivating for years. Thomas was now CEO of Jensen Financial, the pinnacle of the success he'd sacrificed his family for. And Ethan was on a trajectory that could, with the right guidance and opportunities, eventually put him in position to cross paths with his father professionally. The question was, did I still want that? Did the revenge I'd meticulously plotted still matter after all these years? As I stood at our apartment window, looking out at the glittering Manhattan skyline, I realized it did. Not from a place of fresh pain or rage, but from a conviction that actions should have consequences. That Thomas should someday face the son he'd denied and recognize all that he'd thrown away. The next morning, I made a call to an old college friend who now headed the business department at Columbia University. David, remember that favor you've been offering for years? I'd like to cash it in for my son. Ethan graduated high school at the top of his class and entered Columbia's accelerated business program with a prestigious scholarship. He thrived in the challenging environment, his natural abilities enhanced by years of carefully cultivated interests and skills. By 19, he'd launched his first startup, a platform connecting environmental nonprofits with corporate funding, while still completing his studies. By 21, he'd sold it for a modest but impressive sum and was already working on his next venture, a financial technology company focused on sustainable investment. I watched his rise with pride and a sense of vindication that I kept carefully hidden. Ethan's success was his own, earned through hard work and genuine talent. I had merely opened doors. He had walked through them on his own merit. During these years, I kept tabs on Thomas from a distance. His tenure as CEO of Jensen Financial was marked by aggressive expansion and record profits, though not without controversy. Several of his acquisitions had resulted in massive layoffs, and there were whispers of ethical corners cut, though nothing that crossed into illegality that I could use. Victoria remained by his side, the perfect corporate wife, though they remained childless, a detail that gave me a petty satisfaction I wasn't proud of, but couldn't deny. We managed to avoid further direct encounters, though New York's business and social circles occasionally brought us to the same events. On these rare occasions, we acknowledged each other with cool civility and kept our distance. I never mentioned these moments to Ethan, though I sometimes caught Thomas watching my son from across rooms, a perplexed expression on his face, as if trying to place a familiarity he couldn't quite identify. Ethan, focused on his own goals and surrounded by friends and mentors who valued him, seemed untroubled by his biological father's ghostly presence in our lives. He dated, traveled, built relationships that were healthy and reciprocal. If the abandonment had left scars, and I knew it had, he didn't allow them to define him. When Ethan turned 23, his latest venture, a company called Horizon Sustainable Finance, attracted serious attention from venture capitalists. The innovative platform allowed investors to put their money into carefully vetted green technology and social impact projects while maintaining competitive returns. We're going into the final round of Series A funding. He told me over dinner one evening, practically vibrating with excitement. If we secure this, Mom, Horizon could change the whole landscape of environmental investment. That's wonderful, sweetheart. I squeezed his hand across the table, my chest tight with pride. I always knew you'd do something extraordinary. His smile turned thoughtful. I've been thinking a lot about what drives me, why this matters so much. He paused, meeting my eyes. It's because of you. Watching you fight for what's right all these years, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Tears pricked at my eyes. Ethan, no, let me finish. His voice was gentle but determined. You never gave up. When he left, when things were tough, you just kept going. You taught me that actions have consequences, that integrity matters more than easy success. His expression grew serious. I want you to know that everything I'm building, it's a testament to that. To you. In that moment, looking at my brilliant, compassionate son, I felt my carefully maintained wall of justification begin to crumble. Had I really been guiding Ethan toward his authentic purpose? Or had I been subtly steering him toward a collision course with Thomas, using my son's genuine talents as instruments of my long-simmering revenge? The question haunted me as Ethan's company continued its meteoric rise. 6 months later, Horizon secured not just its Series A funding, but an unexpected partnership with a major investment bank that would exponentially increase its reach and impact. The night of the announcement, Ethan called me, his voice tinged with disbelief and excitement. Mom, you're not going to believe this. Jensen Financial wants to talk about a strategic partnership with Horizon. My blood ran cold. Jensen? Are you sure? Positive. Their head of sustainable investment reached out directly. Said the CEO himself had taken an interest in our platform. Ethan's voice dropped to a whisper. Mom, this could be huge for us. Jensen's backing would give us credibility with the old guard that we've been struggling to reach. Ethan, I hesitated, unsure what to say. This was both what I'd been unconsciously working toward and what I'd been dreading. The moment when Thomas would come face to face with the son he'd denied. What is it? Ethan asked, picking up on my hesitation. You don't sound excited. I took a deep breath. It's complicated, sweetheart. Jensen Financial ... There's a history there you should know about before you proceed. What kind of history? His voice had turned cautious. Not over the phone. Can you come to dinner tomorrow? James will be out with clients so we can talk privately. He agreed, and I spent a sleepless night contemplating what to tell him. The complete truth? A sanitized version? Nothing at all. allowing events to unfold naturally? By morning, I still hadn't decided. Ethan arrived at our apartment the next evening, looking every inch the successful young entrepreneur in a tailored suit, his confidence tempered by the genuine humility that made him so different from his father. We ate the lasagna I'd prepared, his childhood favorite, while discussing safe topics: his team's reaction to the Jensen interest, James's latest case, my mother's recent visit. Finally, as we moved to the living room with glasses of wine, Ethan fixed me with a direct look. "So what's the deal with Jensen Financial, Mom? Why did you sound so weird about them reaching out?" I set my glass down, choosing my words carefully. "Jensen Financial is run by Thomas Palmer, your biological father." Ethan went very still, his expression unreadable. "He's the CEO? The one who wants to partner with Horizon?" I nodded. "Almost certainly he has no idea who you are. You use my maiden name, and while there's a resemblance, it's been 20 years since he's seen you." 20 years, Ethan repeated softly. "Since he said I wasn't his and walked out?" "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his wine glass. "Does he know we're in New York?" "He knows I am. We've run into each other occasionally at events, but I don't think he knows anything about your life or career." I hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. "Ethan, if you want to walk away from this opportunity, no one would blame you. There are other investors, other partners." "Walk away?" He looked up, something flashing in his eyes that I couldn't quite read. "Why would I do that?" "Because this man abandoned you, denied you, said you weren't his son when any fool could see that I am." Ethan finished my sentence, his voice steady. "I know, Mom. I've seen the baby pictures. I've looked in the mirror. There's never been any doubt in my mind that he lied." I reached for his hand. "Then you understand why you might not want to do business with him." To my surprise, a slow smile spread across Ethan's face. "Actually, I think this might be exactly what I want to do." "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, his eyes, Thomas's eyes, alight with a determination I recognized all too well. "Mom, I've spent my whole life wondering about him. Not because I needed a father. I had you, and later James, and I've never lacked for love or guidance. But because I couldn't understand how someone could just walk away, deny their own child." I swallowed hard. "Ethan!" "Let me finish," he said gently. "All these years I've told myself it was his loss, that someday he'd realize what he threw away. But it was just talk, you know. A way to make myself feel better." His voice hardened slightly. "Now I have a chance to actually show him. Not as some abstract concept, but as a real person. A successful person he wants to do business with." The irony was almost too much. After years of subtly guiding Ethan toward this very scenario, I now found myself hesitating, protective instincts flaring. "Are you sure? This could be emotionally complicated." "I'm sure." His expression was resolute. "And I'm not going to tell him who I am. Not right away, maybe not ever. I just want to look him in the eye as an equal. As someone he needs, not the other way around." I recognized the cold calculation in his voice because it had lived in my own heart for 20 years. "And if he figures it out?" Ethan shrugged, a gesture so reminiscent of Thomas that it made my breath catch. "Then he figures it out, but on my terms, not his." I studied my son's face, seeing in it both the innocent 3-year-old who'd been abandoned and the determined young man who'd risen above that abandonment. Was this the justice I'd been seeking all along? Or was I allowing Ethan to walk into emotional terrain he wasn't prepared for? "Whatever you decide," I said finally. "I'm with you. But be careful, Ethan. Not just of him hurting you again, but of what revenge can do to the person seeking it." He smiled then, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "I learned from the best, Mom. Not just about business, but about having lines I won't cross. This isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming the narrative. My narrative." As I watched him leave that night, straight-backed and purposeful, I wondered if I'd created something I could no longer control. The plan I'd nurtured for 2 decades was finally coming to fruition, but not quite in the way I'd imagined. The initial meeting between Horizon Sustainable Finance and Jensen Financial was scheduled for the following week at Jensen's Manhattan headquarters. Ethan insisted I not attend, though he promised to call me immediately afterward with a full report. "I need to do this myself, Mom," he explained. "I need to see him without you there as a buffer or a reference point. I need to know if he sees anything familiar when he looks at me." I understood, though it took every ounce of self-control not to find a reason to be in that building, to witness the moment when Thomas came face to face with the son he'd denied. The morning of the meeting, I busied myself with work, though my concentration was shot. James, who now knew the full story, did his best to distract me with legal briefs and lunch from my favorite cafe. "He'll be fine," James assured me, his steady presence a balm to my jangled nerves. "Ethan is more than capable of handling himself professionally, even under these circumstances." "I know," I sighed, pushing away a sandwich I couldn't eat. "It's not his abilities I doubt. It's just 20 years, James. 20 years of anger and planning and waiting for some kind of justice. And now that it's happening, I'm terrified it will hurt Ethan more than it hurts Thomas." James considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Have you considered that maybe this isn't about hurting anyone? That maybe, for Ethan, this is about closing a chapter so he can move forward without that question mark hanging over him?" I hadn't, not really. I'd been so focused on my own narrative of justified vengeance that I hadn't fully considered what this moment might mean for Ethan beyond the satisfaction of proving Thomas wrong. My phone rang at precisely 3:15, Ethan's name flashing on the screen. I answered immediately, my heart in my throat. "How did it go?" "He didn't recognize me," Ethan said without preamble, his voice unnervingly calm. Not even a flicker of doubt or recognition. We sat across from each other for 90 minutes, and he had no idea he was looking at his son. I sank onto a nearby chair, a complex mix of emotions washing over me. Relief that Ethan had been spared an awkward recognition scene. Disappointment that Thomas remained so oblivious. Anger that he could look at Ethan, who so clearly resembled him, and see nothing but a business opportunity. "Are you okay?" I asked, concerned by the flatness in Ethan's voice. "Yeah, I'm fine. Actually better than fine." His tone shifted, becoming more animated. "Mom, he was impressed. With me, with Horizon, with our numbers. They're offering not just investment, but a strategic partnership that would put our platform in front of their entire client base. That's wonderful." I managed, trying to match his enthusiasm. "What happens next?" "We have follow-up meetings scheduled for the next 2 weeks, hammering out details." "It's moving fast." He paused. "I'll be working directly with him." He said, and I quote, "I want to personally oversee this partnership. I see a lot of potential in you, Mr. Wilson." I could hear the dark humor in Ethan's voice and felt an answering twist of irony in my gut. Thomas, who had spent 20 years denying his connection to Ethan, was now voluntarily tying his professional reputation to my son's success. "What are you thinking, Ethan?" "Really?" I pressed, needing to gauge his emotional state. He was quiet for a moment. "Honestly?" It was strange. Seeing him in person, watching him talk and gesture, it was like looking at an older version of myself in some ways. But also not. Ethan paused, searching for words. "He's harder than I expected. Colder. Everything is about the bottom line, about what Jensen can gain. There's no real passion for the actual impact of the work." His assessment matched my memories of Thomas in those final months before he left. Ambitious to the point of ruthlessness, increasingly willing to compromise his initially idealistic values for career advancement. "But it doesn't matter," Ethan continued, his voice firming. "This partnership is good for Horizon, good for our mission. I can work with him professionally without letting the personal history affect me." I wasn't sure I believed him. How could such a profound abandonment not color their interactions? But I respected his determination to maintain boundaries. "Just be careful," I cautioned. "Not just emotionally, but professionally. Don't let your personal feelings, whatever they are, cloud your business judgment." "I won't," he promised. "But Mom, there's something else." His voice had dropped, turning serious. Being in that room with him, seeing how everyone deferred to him, how proud he is of what he's built at Jensen, I realized something. "What's that?" "That what I really want isn't for him to recognize me or feel bad about what he did. What I want is to build something better than what he has. Something with actual purpose and positive impact. Something that will last beyond stock prices and quarterly reports." His words hit me with unexpected force. For 20 years, I'd nurtured a vision of Thomas recognizing Ethan and being forced to confront the magnitude of what he'd thrown away. But Ethan's ambition was simultaneously nobler and more devastating, to render Thomas's life work small and hollow by comparison. "You will," I told him, my throat tight with emotion. "You already are." The conversation shifted to practical details, but Ethan's words stayed with me long after we hung up. Had I been wrong all these years? Had my focus on eventual vindication actually limited my vision of Ethan's potential? That night, I pulled out an old photo album I rarely examined. There, preserved behind plastic sheets, were pictures of Thomas holding newborn Ethan, looking down at his son with what appeared to be genuine love. Thomas teaching 2-year-old Ethan to swim, his hands supportive under the little boy's stomach. Thomas and Ethan napping together on our old couch, the toddler sprawled across his father's chest. What had happened to that man? Had he ever really existed, or had it all been a performance, a role Thomas played until it no longer served his ambitions? I closed the album, suddenly exhausted by the weight of 2 decades of anger and calculation. As I slid it back onto its shelf, I made a decision. I would continue to support Ethan in whatever path he chose with regard to Thomas and Jensen Financial, but I would relinquish my own plans for revenge. It was time to truly let go. Or so I thought, until 3 weeks later, when an unexpected visitor arrived at my office. Rebecca. Thomas stood in my office doorway, as impeccably dressed and confidently poised as ever. "Do you have a moment?" I stared at him, momentarily speechless. We hadn't spoken directly since our sidewalk encounter months earlier, and he had certainly never sought me out at work. "Thomas." I finally found my voice, professional instincts kicking in. "This is a surprise. What can I do for you?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, his gaze taking in the awards and certifications that lined my walls. "Impressive," he noted with what seemed like genuine respect. "You've built quite a reputation." "Thank you." I remained seated behind my desk, unwilling to stand and acknowledge his presence more formally. "But I doubt you came all the way to my office to admire my credentials." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Still direct as ever. "No, I'm here about Ethan Wilson." My heart stuttered, but I kept my expression neutral. "What about him?" Thomas sat in the chair opposite my desk without waiting for an invitation. "Brilliant young man. His Horizon platform is exactly what Jensen has been looking for to bolster our sustainable investment portfolio." "I'm aware," I said carefully. "Ethan is my son." "Yes, I know." Thomas leaned forward, his expression intent. "That's actually why I'm here. I want to make sure our history ... won't complicate what could be a very profitable partnership for both Jensen and Horizon." I stared at him, incredulous. After 20 years of absence, after denying his own child, his primary concern was that I might somehow interfere with a business deal? "Our history, as you put it," I said slowly, fighting to keep my voice level, "is that you abandoned your child and denied his existence for your own professional gain? And now you're worried I might..." "What?" "Tell Ethan not to do business with you." A flicker of something, discomfort? Guilt? Crossed Thomas's face before his corporate mask slipped back into place. "Ethan is your son, not mine. That was established long ago." "No, Thomas." I leaned forward, 20 years of carefully contained anger threatening to spill over. "Nothing was established. You made a false claim and walked away. Ethan is your biological son. Any DNA test would confirm it, as would the eyes of anyone who sees you standing next to each other." I paused, watching his face. "Which is why I find it fascinating that you've been meeting with him for weeks and haven't noticed the resemblance." Thomas shifted in his seat, the first sign of genuine discomfort I'd seen. "I don't know what you're trying to imply." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. Ethan Wilson, the brilliant young entrepreneur you're so eager to partner with, is Ethan Palmer by birth, your son." The color drained from Thomas's face. That's not possible." "The test." "What test, Thomas?" I challenged, my voice hard. "The one you claimed to have but never showed me? The one your sister told me you couldn't look her in the eye when discussing? There never was a test, was there? Just a convenient excuse to leave your family for Victoria and your career aspirations." He stood abruptly, pacing to my office window and back, his composure cracking. "This is absurd. I haven't seen that boy since he was 3. How could I possibly recognize him?" I finished. "Perhaps because he's the spitting image of you at that age. Perhaps because on some level biology recognizes biology. Or perhaps because you've spent 20 years deliberately not seeing what's right in front of you." Thomas stopped pacing, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Why are you doing this now? After all this time?" "I'm not doing anything," I said, suddenly weary of the entire conversation. Ethan pursued an opportunity with Jensen Financial because it aligned with his business goals. The fact that you happen to be the CEO is an irony that life sometimes produces. "Does he know?" Thomas's voice had dropped, his usual confidence faltering. "Does he know who I am?" I considered lying, but what would be the point? "Yes, he knows. He's always known who his father is and that you chose to walk away." Thomas sank back into the chair, running a hand through his silvering hair. "And he still took the meeting? Still wants the partnership?" "He's a professional," I said simply. And he believes in the mission of his company enough to work with anyone who can help advance it. Even you. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 20 years of separation and secrets hanging between us. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice strangely vulnerable. I should end the partnership. Create distance. Why? I asked, genuinely curious. Because you're afraid of facing the son you abandoned? Or because you're afraid others might notice the resemblance and question the story you've told all these years? His eyes flashed with something like anger. You don't understand what I've built, what I stand to lose. No, Thomas, you don't understand what you've already lost. I stood, signaling the end of our conversation. 20 years with your son? The chance to see him grow into the remarkable man he is today. That's the real loss, not whatever reputation hit you're worried about now. He rose slowly, looking suddenly older than his years. What do you want from me, Rebecca? Money? Recognition? An apology? I shook my head, a strange sense of peace settling over me. I don't want anything from you anymore, Thomas. I spent years wanting justice or revenge or some kind of reckoning. But looking at you now, I realize you've been living with the consequences of your choice all along, whether you recognized it or not. What is that supposed to mean? It means that while you were building Jensen Financial, I was raising a son with integrity, compassion, and vision, qualities your success hasn't brought you. I moved toward the door. Whether you continue the partnership with Horizon is between you and Ethan. I won't interfere. But know this, he doesn't need your approval, your recognition, or your business. He's already succeeded where it matters most. I opened my office door, a clear dismissal. Thomas hesitated, then moved to leave, pausing in the doorway. He really is exceptional, isn't he? The question was soft, almost to himself. Yes, I affirmed, allowing myself one final twist of the knife. He really is. Entirely without your help. After Thomas left, I sat at my desk for a long time, absorbing what had just happened. After 20 years, Thomas knew. The truth I'd thought would bring me satisfaction had indeed shaken him, but not in the way I'd imagined. There had been no dramatic collapse, no public humiliation, just a private confrontation that seemed to leave him more confused than crushed. I called Ethan, needing to warn him that Thomas now knew their connection. My son took the news with surprising calm. I figured this might happen eventually, he said. Especially once we started working closely together. Does he plan to continue the partnership? He suggested ending it, creating distance, I admitted. I told him that was between the two of you. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I'll reach out to him directly. This doesn't change Horizon's goals or the value of Jensen's distribution network. Ethan, I said carefully, you don't have to prove anything to him. You don't have to be the bigger person here. I know, Mom. His voice was steady. But this isn't about him anymore. It's about building something meaningful, something that will outlast both of us. If working with Jensen advances that goal, then that's what I'll do. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet office, reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. The heartbroken young mother I'd been 20 years ago couldn't have imagined this outcome. My son, strong and purposeful, engaging with his biological father on his own terms, not seeking approval or recognition, but simply pursuing his vision. The revenge I'd meticulously planned for 2 decades had transformed into something I hadn't anticipated. Not the satisfaction of Thomas's downfall, but the quiet triumph of Ethan's rise. Not retribution, but reclamation. And somehow that felt like the most complete justice of all. The fallout from Thomas's realization unfolded in ways I hadn't anticipated. Rather than distancing himself from Horizon as he'd initially suggested, he became more personally involved in the partnership, insisting on weekly meetings with Ethan and taking a visible interest in the platform's development. He keeps staring at me when he thinks I'm not looking, Ethan reported after their 3rd meeting post-revelation. It's like he's trying to reconcile the businessman in front of him with the toddler he walked away from. Is it uncomfortable? I asked, concerned that Thomas's attention might be unwelcome. Ethan considered the question. Not uncomfortable exactly, just strange. He's professional in the meetings, focused on the business. But there are these moments where his mask slips and I can see him struggling with something. Recognition maybe, or regret. Has he said anything? About the past? Not directly, Ethan shook his head. But yesterday he asked if I'd join him for dinner. Just the 2 of us. To discuss the partnership in a less formal setting, he said. My protective instincts flared. You don't have to go, you know. I know. Ethan's expression was thoughtful. But I think I want to. Not for his sake, but for mine. to see who he really is outside the corporate setting. I nodded, respecting his decision while worrying about the potential emotional impact. Just be prepared for anything. He might try to explain away what he did or minimize it, or he might avoid the subject entirely. I'm prepared, Ethan assured me. 20 years is a long time to think about what I might say to him if given the chance. The dinner was scheduled for the following evening at an exclusive Manhattan restaurant. Ethan dressed carefully for the occasion, his expression determined as he prepared to leave our apartment. "How do I look?" he asked, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. "Like a CEO?" I told him honestly, my heart swelling with pride and apprehension. "Ethan, whatever happens tonight, remember who you are. Not just his biological son, but the man you've become on your own terms." He hugged me tightly. "I learned from the best, Mom." I spent that evening with James, trying to distract myself with a movie neither of us really watched. When my phone finally rang shortly after 11, I answered before the first ring had finished. "How did it go?" I asked without preamble. "It was..." Ethan paused, searching for words. "Enlightening." "What happened? What did he say?" "We spent the first hour talking strictly business. Jensen's plans for Horizon, market projections, integration timelines, all very professional and distant. Ethan's voice had a detached quality I recognized as his way of processing complex emotions. Then, after the main course, he ordered an expensive scotch and finally broached the subject. "And?" I prompted when he fell silent. "He didn't deny it, Mom. He admitted that he's known all along on some level that I'm his biological son." I gasped, 20 years of anger resurging in an instant. "He what?" "He said the paternity test was real. He did have one done, but he knew the results were wrong. Said he could see himself in me even when I was a baby, but by the time the test came back negative, he'd already convinced himself that leaving was the right move for his career. The test just gave him the excuse he needed." I gripped the phone tightly, my free hand curling into a fist. That absolute... "Wait, there's more," Ethan interrupted. "He said that walking away from us was the biggest mistake of his life. That he spent 20 years trying to justify it to himself by focusing on his success, his wealth, his status. But seeing me now, working with me, he can't deny what he threw away anymore." My anger mellowed into something more complex, vindication mixed with a lingering sense of the waste of it all. "Did he apologize?" "Yes." Ethan's voice was quiet. "He did. Said he knows it's 20 years too late, that he doesn't expect or deserve forgiveness. But he wanted me to know that he regrets his choice every day." "And what did you say?" I held my breath, unsure what I wanted Ethan's response to have been. I told him thank you for his honesty, but that I didn't need his apology or his regret. That I've had a good life with you, that I'm proud of who I am and what I'm building. Ethan's voice strengthened. And then I told him that Horizon would be proceeding with the Jensen partnership because it makes good business sense, but that he and I would never have a personal relationship beyond professional respect. I closed my eyes, a complex wave of emotions washing over me. Pride in Ethan's dignity and clarity, satisfaction that Thomas had finally acknowledged his mistake, a lingering sadness for the relationship that might have been had Thomas made different choices 20 years ago. "How do you feel?" I asked gently. "Lighter," Ethan admitted after a moment. "Like I've been carrying this question mark my whole life. Why wasn't I enough for him to stay? And now I know it was never about me. It was about his own weakness, his own misplaced priorities." He paused. "I don't hate him, Mom. I just don't need him." "I'm proud of you," I said, meaning it more deeply than perhaps ever before. "So proud of the man you've become." After we hung up, I sat with James on our balcony, sharing the details of Ethan's dinner as the city lights twinkled around us. "So that's it?" James asked, his arm warm around my shoulders. 20 years of waiting for some kind of justice, and it ends with a business partnership and a too-late apology? I considered the question, watching an airplane's lights track across the night sky. "I think justice doesn't always look the way we expect it to," I said finally. "For years I wanted Thomas to suffer, to lose everything the way we had. But watching Ethan tonight, seeing his strength and clarity, that's the real justice. Not that Thomas lost, but that we won despite him." James pressed a kiss to my temple. "You did that, Rebecca. You turned what could have been a tragedy into a triumph." "We did," I corrected, thinking of all the people who had helped along the way. My mother, Melissa, James himself, and most of all Ethan, with his resilience and determination. But the story isn't over yet. 6 months later, I stood in the back of a crowded press conference room, watching my son take the podium. At 24, Ethan was the youngest CEO to ring the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange, Horizon Sustainable Finance having gone public in a record-breaking IPO. Thomas stood to one side of the stage, alongside other key investors and partners. As Jensen Financial's CEO, his presence made perfect business sense, though the irony of the moment wasn't lost on me or, I suspected, on him. His expression as he watched Ethan command the room was unreadable from my position, but I thought I detected a mixture of pride and regret in his posture. "Thank you all for being here today," Ethan began, his voice confident and clear. "Horizon was founded on a simple principle, that financial success and positive global impact aren't mutually exclusive, that we can build prosperity while protecting our planet and its people." As he continued outlining Horizon's mission and future goals, I felt a presence beside me and turned to find Melissa, Thomas's sister, quietly joining me at the back of the room. "He's remarkable," she whispered, her eyes on Ethan, the spitting image of Thomas at that age, but with something Thomas never had, a moral compass. I smiled at her, grateful for her unwavering support over the years. "Thank you for being here. It means a lot to both of us." I wouldn't have missed it. She glanced toward her brother on the stage. "Thomas asked if I'd be coming. I think he's uncomfortable facing the family he abandoned, but he can't stay away from Ethan. It's like he's drawn to him, trying to make up for lost time through this business relationship." "Too little, too late," I murmured, though the bitterness that had once accompanied those words had largely dissipated. "Yes," Melissa agreed, "but perhaps better than nothing at all." As if sensing our discussion, Thomas glanced back at that moment, his eyes finding mine in the crowd. We held each other's gaze for a long moment, not with hostility or even anger anymore, but with a shared acknowledgement of what had been lost and what, against all odds, had been salvaged. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture somewhere between a nod of respect and an acknowledgement of defeat. I returned the gesture, then deliberately shifted my attention back to Ethan, where it belonged. After the press conference during the celebratory reception, I watched from across the room as Thomas approached Ethan, offered a formal handshake for the cameras, then said something that made my son nod seriously. They stood side by side briefly, the resemblance between them unmistakable to anyone paying attention, the same jaw, the same eyes, the same way of gesturing when making a point. Later, when the crowds had thinned and Ethan had a moment alone with me, I asked what Thomas had said to him. "He told me he was proud of what I've built," Ethan replied, swirling the champagne in his glass. "Said that Horizon represents the future of finance in a way that traditional institutions like Jensen need to learn from, not just partner with." High praise. It was. Ethan's expression turned thoughtful. He also said something else when the photographers had moved on. He said, "Your mother did an exceptional job raising you. Better than I ever could have." Unexpected tears pricked at my eyes. After 20 years, it was perhaps the most honest thing Thomas had ever said. "Is that true, do you think?" Ethan asked, watching me carefully. "Was it better in the end that he left? That it was just you and me?" I considered the question, looking around at the celebration of Ethan's success achieved through hard work, vision, and integrity. "I don't know if better is the right word," I said finally. "I would never choose for you to have experienced that abandonment, that pain. But I do know that you became exactly who you were meant to be, Ethan, and I couldn't be prouder of that man." He smiled then, the same smile that had kept me going through the darkest days after Thomas left. "There's one more thing I haven't told you yet. About the partnership with Jensen? What's that? With this IPO, Horizon has the capital to expand significantly. Our board has approved an acquisition strategy targeting smaller ethical investment firms to bring under our umbrella." His smile turned slightly mischievous. "And our first major acquisition target is Jensen Financial's Sustainable Investment Division." I stared at him, understanding dawning. "You're buying Thomas's division? The one he personally oversees?" "If the deal goes through, and our initial talks suggest it will, that division's leadership would report directly to me." Ethan's expression was professional, but I could see the satisfaction beneath. Thomas would remain Jensen's CEO, of course, but this particular piece of his empire would be under Horizon's control. The elegant symmetry of it took my breath away. 20 years after Thomas had walked away from his responsibility as Ethan's father, Ethan would assume authority over a piece of Thomas's professional legacy, not out of revenge, but as a natural consequence of Horizon's success and strategic vision. "Does he know?" I asked. "Yes," He's the one who suggested it, actually. Ethan looked as surprised by this as I felt, said the division would thrive better under Horizon's direction than Jensen's traditional framework. That sometimes the best thing a parent company can do is recognize when a spin-off would be better served elsewhere. The metaphor wasn't subtle, and I wondered if Thomas had intended it to be his version of making amends, acknowledging through this business decision what he couldn't fully express in personal terms. So what happens now? I asked, still processing this unexpected turn. Ethan's expression turned determined, focused on the future rather than the past. Now we build something that lasts, something that matters. Not to prove anything to him, but because it's the right thing to do. As the evening wound down, I found myself alone on the venue's balcony, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. The door opened behind me, and I knew without turning who had joined me. "Congratulations," Thomas said quietly, coming to stand beside me at the railing. "He's extraordinary." "Yes, he is." I didn't look at him, keeping my gaze on the city lights. "Rebecca." His voice held a note I'd never heard before, something like humility. "I know no apology could ever be sufficient for what I did. To both of you." "No," I agreed. "It couldn't." He nodded, accepting this. "I've been thinking a lot about choices lately. About roads not taken. That's a luxury you've earned, I suppose," I said, not unkindly. "The ability to look back and philosophize about your choices from the comfort of success." Success. He echoed the word, a bitter edge to his voice. By some measures, perhaps. But watching Ethan today, seeing what he's built, the purpose behind it, the respect he commands not just for his business acumen, but for his vision and integrity. He paused. It makes what I've spent 20 years building seem hollow by comparison. I turned to look at him then, really look at him, for the first time in years. The handsome face that had once been so beloved to me now showed the lines of age and the weight of choices made. The confident posture I'd admired now seemed more like a practiced performance than natural assurance. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Why now, after all this time?" Thomas met my gaze directly, no evasion in his eyes for once. "Because I want you to know that I understand now what I threw away. Not just a family, but the chance to be part of something meaningful. The chance to help raise a son who might have made me a better man." He looked back toward the reception, where Ethan was visible through the glass doors, laughing with investors and team members. "Instead, I left that entirely to you, and you did it perfectly without me. The vindication I'd sought for so long washed over me, but it felt different than I'd imagined. Quieter, more complex, tinged with a sadness for all that had been lost. I didn't do it to prove you wrong, Thomas," I said finally. "I did it because he deserved nothing less than my best. Because every child deserves that." "I know." He nodded, a flicker of genuine emotion crossing his face. "That's what makes you extraordinary, too." We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of 20 years hanging between us. Not quite reconciliation, but perhaps something like closure. "The acquisition deal," I said eventually. "Was that your way of trying to make amends?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Partly, but it's also good business. Ethan's vision for sustainable finance is the future. Jensen needs to adapt or be left behind." He paused. "And if there's a certain poetic justice in my son becoming the de facto authority over something I built, well, perhaps that's as it should be." "Yes," I agreed softly. "Perhaps it is." As Thomas moved to leave, he hesitated, then asked, "Do you think someday he might—" "I don't know," I interrupted, understanding the question he couldn't quite voice. "That's for Ethan to decide, not me. You'll have to earn whatever relationship might be possible, knowing it will never be what it could have been." He nodded, accepting this hard truth. "I'll settle for professional respect. It's more than I deserve." After he left, I remained on the balcony, reflecting on the long, strange journey that had brought us to this moment. 20 years ago, standing in our kitchen as Thomas walked out the door, I couldn't have imagined this outcome, not just the material success, but the emotional resolution, the sense that finally the scales had balanced. When Ethan joined me some minutes later, concern on his face, I smiled reassuringly. "I saw Thomas come out here," he said. "Are you okay?" "I am." And for the first time in 20 years, I meant it completely. Better than okay, actually. I think I've finally let go of something I've been carrying for a very long time. Ethan studied my face, then nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. He put his arm around my shoulders, and together we looked out at the city sprawling before us, a city where, against all odds, an abandoned 3-year-old had grown into a visionary leader, where a devastated young mother had rebuilt her life with dignity and purpose, and where, just maybe, redemption was possible even after the deepest betrayals. "Your son isn't mine," Thomas had said before leaving us 20 years ago. But standing here now, with Ethan's arms strong around my shoulders and his future bright before him, I knew with absolute certainty that he had never been more wrong. Ethan had always been his son, his biological legacy in the world. But more importantly, Ethan had always been mine, my heart, my purpose, my greatest achievement. And together we had transformed what could have been our destruction into our salvation. As we turned to rejoin the celebration inside, Ethan paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, Mom, for years I imagined this moment, becoming successful enough that he'd have to acknowledge me, have to regret what he did. And now that it's happening?" I asked gently. Ethan smiled, a genuine smile with no bitterness behind it. "Now I realize it doesn't matter, that his regret or recognition doesn't define me, that what we built together, you and I, that's what matters." I hugged him tightly, my brilliant, compassionate son who had grown beyond revenge to something far more powerful, genuine self-worth independent of his father's validation. "Yes," I agreed, my heart full. "That's exactly what matters." The next 2 years passed in a whirlwind of growth and change. Horizon expanded rapidly under Ethan's leadership, absorbing not just Jensen Financial's sustainable investment division, but several other ethical finance companies as well. The business press dubbed him the Conscience of Wall Street, a title that amused Ethan but which he privately took seriously as both a compliment and a responsibility. Our lives settled into a new rhythm. Ethan moved into a spacious loft in Tribeca, though he still came for dinner at least once a week. James and I finally married in a small ceremony, with Ethan proudly walking me down the aisle. My environmental law practice thrived alongside James's, our reputation for taking on and winning challenging cases growing with each success. Thomas remained a peripheral figure in our lives, present professionally in Ethan's world, but maintaining the respectful distance my son had established. I occasionally spotted him at industry events or charity galas, our interactions limited to polite nods or brief, impersonal exchanges. The rage that had fueled me for so long had finally burned itself out, replaced by something like indifference. Thomas Palmer was simply a person who had once been important to me, who had fathered my child, and who now existed primarily as a business connection in Ethan's professional orbit. Or so I believed, until the morning Ethan called me from his office, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. "Mom, are you sitting down?" he asked without preamble. "I can be," I replied, moving from the kitchen to the living room sofa. "What's happened? Is everything okay?" "Thomas is sick," Ethan said bluntly. "Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. I sat in stunned silence, unsure how to respond. After so many years of anger followed by careful indifference, I hadn't expected to feel anything at news of Thomas's illness. But a complex wave of emotions washed over me, not grief exactly, but a strange, hollow ache for what might have been, for the man I had once loved, for the family we might have remained. "How did you find out?" I finally asked. "He told me himself." Ethan's voice was carefully neutral. "Asked me to meet him for breakfast this morning, which was unusual enough. Then he just laid it out. Very matter of fact. Said his prognosis isn't good. 6 months, maybe a year with aggressive treatment." "I see." I took a deep breath. "And how do you feel about this?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Confused mostly, Ethan admitted. "I've spent most of my life not needing this man, learning to live without his presence or approval. Now suddenly there's this ticking clock, this finite amount of time where, I don't know, decisions need to be made." "What kind of decisions, sweetheart?" "He wants to get to know me," Ethan said, a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Before it's too late." Said he doesn't expect forgiveness, but he'd like the chance to at least know who I've become. "Who you raised me to be?" I closed my eyes, sorting through my own tangled reactions. Part of me, the part that had spent 20 years nursing anger and pain, wanted to tell Ethan that Thomas had forfeited any right to know him, that this 11th hour attempt was too little, too late. But another part, the part that had watched my son grow into a man capable of tremendous compassion and integrity, knew that decision wasn't mine to make. What do you want to do? I asked gently. I don't know, Ethan confessed. Part of me thinks he doesn't deserve this chance, that he made his choice 20 years ago. But, I prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice. But another part wonders if I would regret it if I turn him away now. His voice dropped lower, not for his sake, but for mine. Would I look back someday and wish I'd at least heard what he had to say? Known who he really was beyond the businessman I've been dealing with? Those are valid questions, I acknowledged. And only you can answer them. What would you do, Mom? He asked, sounding suddenly younger than his 26 years. If you were me? I considered the question carefully, wanting to give my son the honest guidance he deserved. I think, I said slowly, that forgiveness isn't about whether the other person deserves it. It's about whether holding on to anger and resentment is serving you anymore. I paused, organizing my thoughts. For me, it took 20 years to let go of my anger toward Thomas, and even then, it wasn't really forgiveness so much as moving beyond it. But your situation is different. You're not me, and your relationship with Thomas, or lack thereof, is your own. That's not really an answer, Ethan noted, a hint of his usual wry humor returning. No, it's not. I agreed with a small smile he couldn't see. Because I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here, just what feels right to you. But I will say this. I raised you to be compassionate without being a doormat, to have integrity while still protecting your heart. Whatever you decide, I'll support you completely. After we hung up, I sat for a long time on the sofa, staring at nothing. Thomas was dying, the man who had once been the center of my world, who had then become the focus of my most bitter resentment, was facing his mortality. And my son, our son, was being asked to consider allowing him back into his life, even if only temporarily. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years I had fantasized about Thomas crawling back, begging for forgiveness, only to be coldly rejected. Now that something vaguely resembling that scenario was actually occurring, I found myself hoping Ethan would choose compassion over rejection, not for Thomas's sake, but for his own. I picked up my phone and dialed James, needing his steady, thoughtful perspective. Thomas is dying, I said when he answered. Pancreatic cancer. Oh. His pause contained understanding of all the complicated emotions this news would evoke. How are you feeling about that? I don't know yet, I admitted. But Ethan's struggling with whether to allow Thomas into his life before it's too late? And you're worried about him getting hurt again? James observed. Yes, I sighed. But I'm also worried about him regretting it if he doesn't take this chance. Rebecca, James said gently, you've spent 20 years protecting Ethan from the pain Thomas caused. Maybe this is something you need to let him navigate on his own terms, even if there is risk involved. I know you're right, I conceded. I hate the idea of Thomas hurting him again, even unintentionally. Ethan isn't that vulnerable 3-year-old anymore, James reminded me. He's a grown man who's built a life and an identity completely separate from Thomas. Whatever relationship they might or might not develop now, it wouldn't be about dependency or abandonment. It would be two adults choosing to know each other before it's too late. His words helped settle some of my anxiety, though not all of it. But James was right. Ethan was an adult now, capable of making his own decisions about Thomas, and protected by the strong sense of self-worth we'd built together over the years. 3 days later, Ethan called to tell me he'd decided to meet with Thomas once a week. Just an hour or two, nothing more. Professional topics would be off limits. This was strictly about whatever personal connection they might be able to forge in the time Thomas had left. Are you sure? I asked, careful to keep my tone neutral. No, Ethan admitted with a frankness that made me smile despite the serious topic. But I'm sure I'd regret not trying. Then I think you're making the right choice. I told him, meaning it. Just guard your heart, okay? Always, he promised. I learned from the best. The weekly meetings began, and to my surprise, Ethan rarely shared the details with me afterward. He would mention they'd met, sometimes offer a vague comment about the conversation being interesting or intense, but otherwise kept the substance private. I respected his boundaries, though curiosity occasionally gnawed at me. It was Melissa, Thomas's sister, who eventually provided some insight when we met for lunch about a month after the meetings had begun. He's trying, Becca, she said, stirring her tea thoughtfully. Thomas, I don't think I've ever seen him so, I don't know, human? Vulnerable? He's actually talking about feelings, about regrets. It's like the cancer diagnosis stripped away all that corporate armor he's been hiding behind for decades. How nice for him. I replied, more sharply than I'd intended. I softened my tone. Sorry, that was uncalled for. I'm glad he's finding some peace or whatever. I just hope he's not hurting Ethan in the process. Melissa studied me with kind eyes. I don't think he is. From what Thomas has shared, Ethan is very much in control of these conversations. He asks the questions, he sets the boundaries. Thomas is just answering, being honest for once in his life. I nodded, somewhat reassured. It sounded like Ethan was approaching these meetings with the self-protective caution I'd hoped for. Has he told Ethan why he really left? I asked, the question that had lingered for 20 years finally spilling out. The truth behind that fake paternity denial? Melissa's expression turned grave. Yes, I believe he has. But I think that's Ethan's story to share with you, if and when he's ready. I accepted this, though it wasn't easy. The mystery of Thomas's abrupt abandonment had haunted me for so long that closure seemed like a mirage always shimmering on the horizon, never quite within reach. Another month passed, during which Thomas began his cancer treatment, an aggressive protocol that Ethan mentioned was taking a visible toll. I didn't ask for details, choosing instead to let my son volunteer information at his own pace. But I worried about him, about the emotional impact of watching the father who had abandoned him deteriorate physically, regardless of their complicated history. Then one evening, Ethan arrived at our apartment unannounced, his expression troubled in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager grappling with his identity. "Can we talk?" he asked, accepting the glass of wine James offered before discreetly excusing himself to give us privacy. "Of course," I said, leading him to the living room. "What's on your mind?" Ethan sat on the sofa, staring into his wine glass as if it contained answers to questions he hadn't yet articulated. "Thomas told me why he left," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "The whole story. Not just the excuse about the paternity test, but the real reason behind it all." I sat very still, my heart accelerating. "And?" I prompted gently when Ethan fell silent. He looked up. His eyes, so like Thomas's, filled with a complexity of emotions I couldn't fully decipher. "He was having an affair with Victoria, that much we knew," Ethan began. "But it wasn't just any affair. She was pregnant when he left us." I gasped, the revelation hitting me like a physical blow. Victoria was pregnant? But they don't have children. They never had children. She lost the baby 3 months after Thomas moved in with her, Ethan continued, his gaze steady on mine, and then discovered she couldn't have more. Some medical condition that makes pregnancy unlikely. The implications of this cascaded through my mind. Thomas had left us, denied his own son for a child that never came to be. The cruel irony of it made my head spin. So he abandoned his actual child for a potential one that never existed? The bitterness I thought I'd moved beyond surged back, sharp and acrid. "It's more complicated than that," Ethan said, surprising me with what sounded like a defense of Thomas. He didn't know the paternity test was wrong at first. Victoria had convinced him that the timing lined up, that her pregnancy had to be his. And he did genuinely believe at first that I might not be his biological son. But he admitted he knew better later, I reminded him, struggling to keep my tone neutral. "He told you himself he could see himself in you even as a baby." "Yes," Ethan nodded. "He said once he'd made the choice to leave, once he'd told himself the story that justified abandoning us, he couldn't bring himself to face the truth, even when doubts crept in. And after Victoria lost the baby, he was too proud to admit he'd made a catastrophic mistake," I finished for him. "Too cowardly to try to make things right. That's part of it," Ethan agreed. "But there's more." He took a deep breath, as if preparing to share something even more difficult. "Thomas was raised by a father who abandoned his first family," he said quietly. "His biological father left his mother and older siblings when Thomas was just a baby. The man he grew up thinking was his father was actually his stepfather." I stared at Ethan, stunned. In all our years together, Thomas had never once mentioned this. He'd spoken of his parents as a solid unit, a traditional family who'd raised him and Melissa with conventional values and expectations. "He never told me that," I said softly. "Not once in 7 years together. He said he never told anyone except Victoria," Ethan replied. "He found out when he was 19, accidentally discovered papers his mother had hidden, confronted her and learned the truth, that the man he thought was his father had actually adopted him when he married Thomas's mother. I struggled to process this new information. That's significant, but it doesn't excuse what he did to you. Plenty of people discover difficult truths about their parentage without abandoning their own children." "I know," Ethan said, "and he knows it too." He's not offering it as an excuse, just as context. He said learning about his own father's abandonment created this pattern in his mind. This idea that men leave, that fatherhood is optional. I thought about the psychological implications of this revelation, how Thomas's own experience of paternal abandonment, even discovered later in life, might have created a template for his behavior, a sort of unconscious permission slip to repeat the cycle. And yet he's telling you this now, I noted. When he's running out of time, yes. Ethan set down his wine glass, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He said the cancer diagnosis made him realize how much time he'd wasted, how many mistakes he'd justified to himself. He looked at me directly. He also said he never stopped loving you, Mom. That leaving was the biggest regret of his life, beyond even missing my childhood. I flinched, unprepared for this particular disclosure. That's not fair to you, Ethan. He shouldn't be putting you in the middle like that, making you carry messages about feelings that are 2 decades too late. I don't think he meant it that way, Ethan said thoughtfully. He wasn't asking me to tell you exactly. It just came up as part of his broader reflection on the choices he's made. And I thought you should know. I nodded, unsure how to process this information, or what to do with the jumble of emotions it evoked. Relief at finally understanding the full story behind Thomas's abandonment. Anger that his reasoning had been so fundamentally selfish, trading a real child for a potential one because it aligned with his career ambitions. A strange, hollow grief for the man I had loved, who had been shaped by a parental abandonment he'd never disclosed to me, and an unexpected tendril of something like compassion, not for the choices Thomas had made, but for the damaged, flawed person behind them. How do you feel about all this? I asked Ethan, setting aside my own complicated reactions to focus on my son's well-being. He was quiet for a long moment, considering. Sad mostly, he finally said. Sad for the 3-year-old who lost his father over such pettiness. Sad for you, having to rebuild your life after being betrayed so completely. Sad even for Thomas, who sacrificed so much authentic happiness for such shallow temporary rewards. His insight struck me anew, his emotional maturity evident in the balanced perspective he maintained, despite the personal nature of the injury. But also, he continued, looking up with an expression that reminded me powerfully of the thoughtful child he had been, also strangely freed. Knowing the full story, understanding the weakness and fear that drove his choices, it removes any lingering doubt that his leaving had anything to do with me, with who I was as a child or who I've become as a man. Relief washed over me at his words. This had been my deepest fear about these meetings with Thomas, that somehow my son would be left once again questioning his worth, wondering why he hadn't been enough to keep his father present in his life. That's a valuable perspective, I said softly. There's one more thing, Ethan added, a slight hesitation in his voice. Thomas has asked if you would consider meeting with him. Just once before. He didn't finish the sentence. I stiffened involuntarily. I don't think that's a good idea. I told him you'd probably say that. Ethan nodded. And I'm not pushing for it. I just promised I'd pass along the request. I appreciated Ethan's neutrality, his respect for my boundaries even as he navigated his own evolving relationship with Thomas. Let me think about it, I said, not wanting to issue an absolute refusal that might somehow complicate things for Ethan. No promises, but I'll consider it. He smiled, the tension in his shoulders visibly easing. That's all I can ask. After Ethan left, I sat up late into the night with James, processing the revelations and the unexpected request for a meeting. Do you want to see him? James asked directly, his tone free of judgment. I don't know, I admitted. For so long, Thomas was this monolith in my mind, this symbol of betrayal and abandonment. Now he's just a dying man with regrets. It changes the calculus somehow. James nodded. No matter what you decide, remember that you don't owe him closure or forgiveness. This is about what feels right to you, not what might ease his conscience in his final months. I leaned against his steady shoulder, grateful for his unwavering support. I think I need time to process all of this before I decide anything. Take all the time you need, he said, pressing a kiss to my temple. And whatever you choose, I'm with you. 2 weeks later, Ethan called with news that rendered the question of whether to meet with Thomas temporarily moot. The cancer had spread more aggressively than expected, and Thomas had been hospitalized following a severe reaction to his latest round of treatment. How serious is it? I asked, hearing the concern in my son's voice. Serious enough that they're talking about stopping treatment, focusing on quality of life rather than quantity, Ethan replied. The doctors are being typically vague, but Melissa thinks he might have weeks rather than months at this point. Are you okay? I asked immediately, worried about the emotional impact of this accelerated timeline. He paused, considering. I'm processing it. It's strange. A few months ago, Thomas was just this abstract figure in my life, this distant professional connection. Now I'm visiting him in the hospital, talking to his doctors, coordinating with Melissa about practical arrangements. He sounded both bewildered and resigned, struggling to navigate the abrupt shift from estrangement to intimate involvement in Thomas's final decline. That's a lot to handle, I said softly, especially given your history. Victoria's barely around, Ethan continued, a note of unexpected anger entering his voice. Can you believe that? Her husband of 20 years is dying, and she's too busy with some charity board position to spend more than an hour a day at the hospital. I bit back my instinctive response that Victoria had always struck me as exactly the type of fair-weather partner who would disappear when things got difficult. Instead, I focused on the uncharacteristic edge in Ethan's tone. It sounds like you're getting more invested in Thomas's care than you anticipated, I observed carefully. I'm not doing it for him, Ethan said quickly, defensively. Then, more honestly, at least not entirely for him. It's complicated, Mom. I still haven't forgotten or fully forgiven what he did, but watching someone die alone with only paid staff for company, I don't think I could live with myself if I walked away now, knowing I could have provided some comfort. Pride swelled within me, pride in the compassionate, principled man my son had become, capable of offering kindness even to someone who had caused him profound pain. You don't need to justify your choices to me, sweetheart, I told him warmly. I think what you're doing shows remarkable strength of character. Thanks, Mom. He sounded tired but resolute. Actually, there's something else. Thomas has been asking for you again. I think the prognosis change has made him more urgent about it. I closed my eyes, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. The thought of seeing Thomas again, especially in a vulnerable state, evoked a complex mixture of reluctance and something like obligation. Not to him, but to the finality of the situation. I'll think about it, I promised. Really think about it this time. After hanging up, I walked to the window of our apartment, looking out at the Manhattan skyline as I had so many times before when contemplating difficult decisions. The truth was, I had been avoiding making a choice about seeing Thomas, letting the theoretical future meeting remain safely abstract. Now, with his condition deteriorating rapidly, the decision had become immediate and concrete. Did I want to see Thomas before he died? Did I need to? Would it provide some kind of closure, or would it simply reopen old wounds? And perhaps most importantly, would I regret it later if I chose not to go? I called the one person who might offer perspective without judgment, Melissa. Thomas's sister had remained a steadfast presence in our lives even during the years of estrangement from her brother, her loyalty to Ethan and me never wavering, despite her continued relationship with Thomas. He's asking for you, she confirmed when I broached the subject. But Becca, this has to be your choice. No one would blame you for staying away, least of all Thomas. What would I even say to him after all this time? I asked, giving voice to one of my primary concerns. We're not the same people we were 20 years ago. He's certainly not the man I once loved. Maybe you don't need to say anything, Melissa suggested gently. Maybe just being there, acknowledging his existence in these final weeks would be enough. For him or for me? I asked, not entirely rhetorically. Both, possibly, she replied. Look, I'm not going to pretend Thomas deserves your forgiveness or even your presence. What he did to you and Ethan was unforgivable. But sometimes we do difficult things not because the other person deserves it, but because it helps us close chapters in our own lives. Her words echoed the advice I'd given Ethan weeks earlier about his own decision to engage with Thomas. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. I'll visit tomorrow, I decided, the words emerging before I'd fully formed the intention. Just once, and I make no promises about what I'll say or how long I'll stay. But I'll go. I'll let him know, Melissa said, relief evident in her voice. And Becca? Thank you. The hospital room was quieter than I expected, the typical medical beeps and hums muted to a background whisper. Thomas lay in the bed, his formerly robust frame now thin and frail beneath the blankets, his complexion ashen. The changes in his appearance shocked me, though I'd mentally prepared myself based on Ethan's descriptions. This gaunt figure barely resembled the vital, confident man who had walked out of our lives 20 years ago, or even the composed CEO I'd encountered occasionally in recent years. His eyes were closed when I entered, and for a moment I thought he might be sleeping. I considered retreating, both relieved and disappointed at the potential reprieve. But then his eyelids fluttered open, and he turned his head slowly toward the door. "Rebecca." His voice was thin but clear, his expression registering surprise and something more complex. Hope, perhaps, or relief. "You came." "Yes." I moved further into the room, stopping at the foot of his bed, maintaining a careful distance. "Ethan and Melissa said you wanted to see me." Thomas struggled to sit up slightly, wincing with the effort. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I admitted, my hands gripping the bedrail to steady myself. The surreality of the moment, standing in a hospital room with the dying man who had once been the center of my world, the source of both my greatest joy and my deepest pain, was almost overwhelming. "You look well," he said, his eyes moving over my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Life has been good to you." "I made it good," I corrected, then immediately regretted the defensiveness in my tone. This wasn't why I had come, to score points or assert my successful recovery from his abandonment. Thomas nodded, accepting the correction. "Yes, you did. You always were the strongest person I knew." I didn't acknowledge the compliment, unsure how to navigate this strange conversation. What did one say to a dying ex-husband who had walked out on his family 2 decades earlier? There were no social scripts for this situation. "Ethan told me about Victoria's pregnancy," I said finally, deciding that honesty was the only viable approach. "About the real reason you left." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "Of course he did. You two always did have a bond I envied, even when he was just a toddler." The admission surprised me. Thomas had never expressed any jealousy of my relationship with Ethan during our marriage, but perhaps his perspective now, filtered through 20 years of absence and regret, had shifted. "It wasn't about you, you know," he continued, his voice growing weaker. "My leaving, it was never about not loving you or Ethan. It was about my own weakness, my own fears. I know that now," I said quietly. "But the why doesn't change the impact, Thomas. It doesn't erase the damage you did to our son." "No," he agreed, his expression pained. "Nothing can erase that. If I could go back." He trailed off, then rallied. "But we can't go back, can we? We can only go forward with the time we have left." The "we" caught me off guard. There was no "we" anymore, hadn't been for 20 years. But I understood what he meant in a broader sense. We could only make choices about the future, not change the past. "Why did you want to see me, Thomas?" I asked directly. "What did you hope to accomplish with this meeting?" He shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable, whether from physical pain or emotional discomfort I couldn't tell. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. "Closure, perhaps. Or maybe just to see you one last time, to tell you face to face how sorry I am for what I did." "Ethan conveyed your apologies," I said, neither accepting nor rejecting them. "I know, but I wanted to say it myself. To look you in the eyes when I tell you that walking away from you and Ethan was the biggest mistake of my life. That I've regretted it every day for 20 years. That the success I traded you for ultimately meant nothing." His voice broke on the last words, and despite myself, I felt a flicker of compassion for this diminished man, confronting the sum total of his life's choices while facing his mortality. "I don't know what you want me to say to that," I told him honestly. "It doesn't change anything, Thomas. It can't give Ethan back his childhood with a father. It can't give me back the years I spent rebuilding the life you shattered." "I know," he whispered. "I don't expect forgiveness, Rebecca. I don't deserve it. I just needed you to hear it directly from me, not filtered through Ethan or Melissa." I nodded, acknowledging his words without offering the absolution he claimed not to seek. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 2 decades of unspoken words hanging between us. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally, his gaze fixed on my face. "You can ask," I replied, not promising an answer. "Were you happy? Eventually, I mean, after ... everything." The question caught me off guard with its simplicity and its unexpected selflessness. He wasn't asking if I had missed him, or if I had ever regretted the divorce. He was asking if I had found happiness despite the pain he had caused. "Yes," I said softly. "Not right away, of course. But yes, I built a good life. A happy life. With James." He nodded. "Ethan speaks highly of him." "James is a good man," I confirmed, feeling no need to elaborate further. And Ethan? Thomas's expression softened. You did an extraordinary job with him, Rebecca. He's remarkable in every way. Yes, he is. I agreed, genuine pride momentarily displacing the tension I felt. Though I can't take all the credit, Ethan made himself who he is, often in spite of difficult circumstances. Circumstances I created? Thomas acknowledged, his gaze dropping to his hands, thin and pale against the hospital blanket. I wish... He trailed off, and I found myself unexpectedly prompting him. What do you wish, Thomas? I wish I could have a do-over, he said simply. One chance to make the right choice instead of the wrong one. To be the husband and father I should have been. The raw honesty in his voice reached something in me, some deeply buried kernel of the woman who had once loved this man completely, who had built dreams and plans around a shared future. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine that alternate reality, the three of us remaining a family, watching Ethan grow up together, navigating life's challenges as partners rather than adversaries. But then reality reasserted itself. There were no do-overs in life, no magical resets that could erase 2 decades of absence and pain. There was only the present moment, with all its complicated history, and whatever future remained. I should go, I said, taking a step back from the bed. Ethan mentioned he'd be stopping by later. Thomas nodded, visibly tired from the emotional exchange. Thank you for coming, Rebecca. It means more than I can express. I hesitated at the door, torn between simply leaving and offering some final word. Something in his diminished appearance, in the knowledge that this was likely the last time I would see him alive, compelled me to speak. I don't forgive you, Thomas, I said quietly. I don't think I can, not completely. But I'm glad Ethan has had this chance to know you, even briefly. And I hope... I paused, searching for words that felt true rather than merely kind. I hope you find peace whatever time you have left. It wasn't absolution, but it was the most authentic closure I could offer, an acknowledgement of our shared history and a recognition of his humanity, flawed and fallible though it was. As I walked out of the hospital into the bright spring afternoon, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, not the entire burden of our painful history, but some portion of it. The Thomas Palmer who had dominated my emotional landscape for so many years, first as beloved partner and then as despised betrayer, had been replaced by a more complex, more human figure, a dying man filled with regrets, facing the consequences of choices made long ago. I called Ethan as I walked toward the subway, feeling a need to connect with my son after the emotionally charged encounter. I saw him, I said when he answered. I know, Ethan replied. He texted me right after you left. He said it was... He paused, seemingly reading from a message. Harder than I expected, but necessary. That's a fair assessment, I agreed. How are you feeling about all this, sweetheart? About Thomas's condition? About the conversations you've been having with him? Ethan was quiet for a moment. It's complicated, he finally said. Part of me is still angry about the 20 years we lost. But another part... He hesitated. Another part is grateful for these few months, for the chance to know him even like this, to understand him even if I can't fully forgive what he did. His words echoed my own conflicted feelings with such precision that I smiled despite the seriousness of the conversation. Ethan truly was my son in all the ways that mattered most. Thoughtful, emotionally nuanced, capable of holding seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously. That makes perfect sense to me, I told him. And for what it's worth, I think you've handled this entire situation with remarkable grace and maturity. I had a good teacher, he replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice despite the somber circumstances. We ended the call with plans to have dinner together later in the week, a normal routine that felt comforting after the emotional intensity of the hospital visit. As I descended into the subway station, surrounded by the everyday rush of New York life, I reflected on the strange, circuitous path that had led to this moment. 20 years ago, standing in our kitchen as Thomas walked out the door, I could never have imagined that our story would end like this, with quiet conversations in a hospital room, with our son building a bridge between past and present, with regret and acceptance rather than triumph or vindication. Life, I was learning yet again, rarely followed the narratives we constructed for it. It was messier, more complex, more surprising than any revenge plot or justice fantasy, and perhaps that was as it should be. Thomas's condition deteriorated rapidly over the next 3 weeks. Ethan kept me informed of developments, though I didn't visit the hospital again. Once was enough, for closure, for acknowledging the past without being consumed by it. My son, however, continued his regular visits, sometimes bringing work to do while Thomas slept, other times engaging in what he described as increasingly philosophical conversations when Thomas was lucid. He asked about my childhood yesterday. Ethan told me over dinner at his Tribeca loft, picking at a pasta dish he'd attempted to cook himself with mixed results. Not the big moments, but the small stuff. What books I liked as a kid, whether I'd had a favorite toy, if I'd been afraid of thunderstorms. And how did that feel? I asked carefully, sensing the emotional weight behind his casual tone. Ethan considered the question, twirling pasta around his fork without eating it. Sad, he finally admitted, but not in the way I expected. Not angry sad, just melancholy, I guess. Sad for all the normal moments that never happened. He looked up at me, his eyes, so like Thomas's, serious in the dim lighting of his fashionable kitchen. Did you know he coached Little League for years? Hospital volunteers bring kids in from the pediatric ward sometimes, and one of the nurses mentioned it. Apparently he's been coaching underprivileged kids in baseball for over a decade. I hadn't known that particular detail about Thomas's life, though it didn't entirely surprise me. The man I had married had shown genuine kindness alongside his ambition. It was only later that the latter had overwhelmed the former. People contain multitudes, I said softly. Even people who've hurt us badly can do good in other areas of their life. I know, Ethan nodded. It's just strange to discover these pieces of him now, when there's so little time left. To realize there was this whole other person existing parallel to our lives all these years. I reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Are you regretting getting to know him? I asked gently. Is it making things harder? No, he said immediately, then qualified, well, yes and no. It's making his dying harder, knowing him as a person rather than just an abstract figure from my past. But I don't regret it. I think I needed this, even if I didn't know it. His phone buzzed on the table and he glanced at it, his expression shifting to concern. It's Melissa, he said, answering. Hey, what's up? I watched as his face grew serious, his posture straightening. Okay, he said after listening for a moment. I'll be there in 30 minutes. He ended the call and looked at me, his eyes shadowed. Thomas has taken a turn for the worse. They don't think he'll make it through the night. My heart constricted unexpectedly. Despite everything, despite 2 decades of anger and pain, the news that Thomas was actively dying affected me more deeply than I had anticipated. Do you want me to come with you? I offered, the words surprising me even as I spoke them. Ethan seemed equally surprised, his eyebrows lifting slightly. Would you? I mean, you don't have to, but I'll come, I decided, seeing the relief in my son's expression. Not for Thomas, but for you. You shouldn't have to go through this alone. 30 minutes later, we entered the hospital room where Thomas lay, his breathing labored, his skin bearing the gray pallor that often preceded death. Melissa sat beside the bed, holding her brother's hand, her face tear-streaked but composed. Victoria was notably absent, a fact that registered as unsurprising but nonetheless sad. He's been asking for you, Melissa told Ethan as we entered. He's drifting in and out, but he keeps saying your name. Ethan moved to the opposite side of the bed, taking Thomas's other hand carefully, mindful of the IV line. I'm here, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion I could see in the tightness around his eyes. Thomas's eyelids flickered, then opened partially. Ethan, he murmured, his voice barely audible. You came. Of course I came, Ethan replied, his tone gentle. Thomas's gaze shifted slightly, registering my presence at the foot of the bed. A ghost of surprise crossed his features, followed by something that might have been gratitude. Rebecca, he whispered. Didn't expect... I'm here for Ethan, I said quietly, honestly. Thomas nodded slightly, understanding. His breathing grew more labored, and a nurse entered, checking monitors and adjusting medication in his IV. He's comfortable, she assured us softly. The morphine is keeping any pain at bay. We settled into a strange, somber vigil, Melissa and Ethan sitting on either side of the bed, me standing at the foot, all of us watching as Thomas's breathing grew increasingly irregular. There was little conversation, just the occasional murmured reassurance when Thomas seemed to become agitated. At one point, Thomas became more lucid, his eyes finding Ethan's face with sudden clarity. Proud of you, he managed, the words slurring slightly but distinct. So proud. who you've become." Ethan's hand tightened around his father's. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother," Thomas's gaze shifted to me again, "did it all, without me, better than would have been with me." "You don't know that," Ethan said gently. "But she did do an amazing job." Thomas nodded weakly, his eyes drifting closed again. For a while, the only sound in the room was his labored breathing, punctuated by the soft beeps of monitoring equipment. The end, when it came, was quiet, almost anticlimactic after the emotional turbulence of the preceding weeks. Thomas drew a deep, rattling breath, then simply didn't take another. The monitor registered the change with a subtle shift in tone, and the nurse who had been checking in periodically entered to confirm what we already knew. "He's gone," she said softly, switching off the monitor's alarm before it could sound. "I'm very sorry for your loss." Melissa wept quietly, still holding her brother's hand. Ethan sat very still, his expression unreadable, his own grip on Thomas's other hand unbroken. I moved to stand behind my son, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Do you want a moment alone with him?" I asked softly. Ethan nodded, and Melissa and I stepped out into the hallway, giving him the private goodbye he needed with the father he had known for such a brief time. 5 minutes later, Ethan emerged, his composure intact but his eyes reddened. "The nurse says we need to—" He gestured vaguely, the practicalities of death momentarily overwhelming him. "I'll take care of it," Melissa said gently. "The arrangements, the notifications. You've done so much already, Ethan." He nodded gratefully, and I slipped my arm through his, offering silent support as we made our way out of the hospital into the quiet night. "Are you okay?" I asked when we reached the sidewalk, the cool air a sharp contrast to the sterile warmth of the hospital. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I feel numb mostly, like it hasn't quite registered yet." I nodded, understanding. "That's normal. It might take a while to process everything." We walked in silence for a block, each lost in our own thoughts. Then Ethan stopped abruptly, turning to face me. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I know that couldn't have been easy for you, given everything. You never have to thank me for being there when you need me," I told him, reaching up to touch his cheek gently. "That's what mothers do." "Not all mothers," he pointed out with a small, sad smile. "I got lucky with mine." We resumed walking, heading toward my apartment by unspoken agreement, neither of us wanting to be alone just yet. "It's strange," Ethan said after another block of silence. "I spent most of my life thinking I didn't need a father, that you were more than enough family for me. And you were, Mom. You absolutely were." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "But these past few months, getting to know Thomas, even in such limited circumstances, it filled in some blank spaces I didn't even realize were there. Not just about him, but about myself." "I understand," I said softly, meaning it. "Our origins shape us, whether we want them to or not. Knowing Thomas, even briefly, gave you context for parts of yourself." "Exactly." He looked relieved at my understanding. "It doesn't change how I feel about you or the life we built together. If anything, it makes me appreciate you more, knowing what you shielded me from all those years." His words warmed me, alleviating a worry I hadn't fully acknowledged, that Ethan's newfound connection with Thomas might somehow diminish the bond we had forged together, the family we had been to each other. "What will you remember most about him?" I asked, curious about what impressions had formed during their brief acquaintance. Ethan considered the question seriously. "His regret?" he finally said. How palpable it was, how it seemed to permeate everything he said and did in these last months. It was almost like a physical presence in the room with us during our conversations. He glanced at me. "It taught me something important, actually, about how the choices we make, especially the selfish ones, follow us. How success or money or status can't outweigh genuine connection. That's a valuable lesson," I acknowledged. "Though I wish it hadn't come at such a cost to you, to both of us," Ethan corrected gently. "I've always known what his leaving cost me, but these past months have made me see more clearly what it cost you too. The betrayal, the abandonment, having to rebuild while raising me alone." We reached my building, but neither of us moved toward the entrance, both reluctant to end this rare moment of complete openness about a subject we had danced around for much of Ethan's life. "You know what's strange?" I said, my breath visible in the cool night air. "For years after Thomas left, I dreamed about revenge. About him realizing what he'd thrown away when it was too late. About him suffering the way we had suffered. I shook my head, smiling sadly. And in some ways, that's exactly what happened. He did realize too late. He did suffer, knowing you as the remarkable man you've become and understanding what he missed. But it doesn't feel like I thought it would, I admitted. There's no satisfaction in it, no sense of justice being served. Just waste. Years that can't be recovered, relationships that can't be fully healed. And now he's gone, and whatever closure might have been possible is limited to what you managed to find in these last months. Ethan nodded, understanding. I think that's the nature of revenge fantasies, isn't it? They're never as satisfying in reality as they are in our imagination. Because what we really want isn't for the other person to suffer, but for the pain they caused us to be undone. And that's the one thing that can never happen. His insight struck me with its clarity and wisdom. It was true. What I had wanted wasn't really for Thomas to suffer, but for the suffering he had caused us to be erased, for the years of struggle and loneliness to be rewound and rewritten. And no amount of regret on his part, no deathbed reconciliation could achieve that impossible goal. When did you get so wise? I asked, only half joking. I had a good teacher, he replied, putting his arm around my shoulders as we finally turned toward the building entrance. The best, actually. As we rode the elevator up to my apartment, I felt a complex mixture of grief and gratitude. Grief for what might have been, for the family we should have remained. Gratitude for what we had built instead, the strong, loving bond between Ethan and me, the good man he had become despite his father's abandonment, the life of purpose and meaning we had each constructed from the ruins of Thomas's betrayal. Thomas Palmer was gone. The man I had once loved, the father who had abandoned his child, the dying figure seeking belated reconciliation, all versions of him had now passed into memory. What remained was the impact he had left on our lives, the lessons his choices had taught us, and the future we would continue to build without him. Later that night, after Ethan had fallen asleep on my sofa and James had returned from his late meeting, I stood at our bedroom window looking out at the city lights, my thoughts drifting through the strange, circuitous journey of the past 20 years. "Are you okay?" James asked softly, coming to stand behind me, his hands gentle on my shoulders. "Yes," I said, realizing as I spoke that it was true. "I'm sad, but not for the reasons I might have expected. Not for the loss of Thomas exactly, but for everything that was lost long before tonight. For the family we should have been. For the father Ethan should have had. That's a healthy perspective," James noted, his voice warm with understanding. Grieving the possibility rather than the person. I turned to face him, grateful beyond words for his steady presence in our lives. "I'm also profoundly thankful," I told him. "For you, for the life we've built, for the man Ethan has become despite everything." James smiled, taking my hand and leading me toward our bed. "Get some rest," he advised gently. "Tomorrow will bring practical matters to handle, funeral arrangements to navigate. Ethan will need your strength." As I drifted toward sleep in the quiet darkness, a memory surfaced unexpectedly. Thomas in our old kitchen, cradling newborn Ethan against his chest, his expression one of wonder and love as he whispered, "He's perfect, Becca. Absolutely perfect." In that moment, he had been sincere. The love had been real, even if it had proved insufficient against his ambition and fear. And Ethan had indeed been perfect, had grown from that tiny, vulnerable infant into the extraordinary man sleeping in our living room, a man of integrity, compassion, and purpose. Perhaps that was the truest form of justice after all, not that Thomas had suffered or regretted his choices, but that Ethan had thrived despite them. That the abandonment that might have defined him had instead become merely one chapter in a much richer, more complex story. That what Thomas had discarded as inconvenient to his ambitions had become the greatest achievement of my life, raising a son who embodied the best of what humanity could be. Thomas was gone, but Ethan remained. And in that simple fact lay all the vindication I would ever need. The funeral was a strange affair, partly a genuine expression of grief from those who had known and cared for Thomas, partly a corporate performance for Jensen financial executives and business associates who attended more out of obligation than affection. Victoria presided like a queen, dry-eyed and impeccably dressed in designer black, accepting condolences with practiced grace while maintaining emotional distance. Ethan and I sat in the front row alongside Melissa and her family, our presence raising eyebrows among those who knew the history but hadn't been aware of the recent reconciliation. My son maintained a dignified composure throughout the service, his expression giving little away about the complex emotions he must have been feeling. The eulogies were revealing in their content and omissions. Business colleagues praised Thomas's strategic vision, his leadership, his market instincts. Friends spoke of his generosity, his loyalty, his commitment to charitable causes. No one mentioned Ethan. No one referenced the son he had abandoned and only reconnected with in his final months. It was as if that entire chapter of his life had been erased from the official narrative. Until, unexpectedly, Melissa rose to speak. She hadn't been on the program, but Victoria nodded tightly when she approached the podium, apparently unwilling to create a scene by objecting. "My brother was a complicated man," Melissa began, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "Brilliant, ambitious, generous in many ways, but also profoundly flawed as all humans are." She looked directly at Ethan as she continued. In the last months of his life, Thomas faced those flaws with courage and honesty. He reconnected with his son Ethan, whom many of you may not know. He acknowledged mistakes he had made decades ago, sought to make what amends he could in the limited time he had left. A ripple of murmurs moved through the congregation, those unfamiliar with this aspect of Thomas's life registering surprise. Victoria's expression remained frozen in a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I believe those final months were Thomas's finest," Melissa concluded, "not because of any business achievement or social status, but because he found the courage to face his greatest regret, to reconnect with the remarkable son he had missed knowing for 20 years. In doing so, he demonstrated that it's never too late to acknowledge our mistakes and attempt to heal the wounds we've created, even if complete healing isn't possible." She returned to her seat beside me, squeezing my hand briefly as she sat down. Ethan's expression remained composed, but I saw the slight sheen of moisture in his eyes, quickly blinked away. After the service, there was a reception at Thomas and Victoria's elegant Upper East Side apartment. Ethan and I debated skipping it, but ultimately decided to make a brief appearance, primarily out of respect for Melissa. As we entered the tastefully decorated space filled with muted conversations and the clink of expensive glassware, I was struck by how little of Thomas's actual personality was evident in his home. The decor was impeccable but impersonal, like a high-end hotel suite rather than a place where someone had lived for years. No personal photographs, no mementos, no evidence of hobbies or interests. It was all surface, all show, a fitting metaphor for the life he had chosen over family and genuine connection. Victoria spotted us almost immediately, making her way through the clusters of guests with determined grace. "Rebecca," she greeted me with cool politeness. "Ethan, thank you for coming. Thomas would have appreciated it." The absurdity of her pretense, acting as if Thomas's relationship with us had been normal and ongoing rather than recently and briefly rekindled after decades of absence, was almost laughable. But for Ethan's sake, I maintained a civil demeanor. "We wanted to pay our respects," I replied neutrally. Victoria's gaze lingered on Ethan's face, a flicker of unease crossing her perfectly composed features. The resemblance between my son and his father had always been striking, but in this moment, surrounded by Thomas's colleagues and friends, it seemed particularly pronounced. "Ethan," she said, her tone shifting to something almost conciliatory, "I hope you know that Thomas spoke of you often in his final weeks. He was impressed by your achievements." "Thank you," Ethan replied politely, though I could sense his skepticism. "That's kind of you to say." An awkward silence fell between us, weighted with 2 decades of unspoken history. Victoria had been the other woman, the catalyst for Thomas's abandonment of his family. Her pregnancy, the pregnancy that had never resulted in a living child, had been the justification for his choice to leave us. And now she stood before us in the apartment she had shared with him, playing the role of grieving widow while we, his actual family, remained outsiders. "If you'll excuse me," Victoria said after a moment, clearly relieved to end the uncomfortable exchange, "I should greet the Jensen board members who just arrived." As she moved away, Ethan and I exchanged a glance that contained volumes of shared understanding. This woman had shaped our lives dramatically, yet remained essentially a stranger to us both. "She seems exactly as I imagined," Ethan murmured, watching Victoria charm an elderly man who must have been a significant business connection. "She was always very focused on appearances," I replied quietly. "On status and connections. They suited each other that way," Ethan observed, a note of sadness rather than bitterness in his voice. both prioritizing the same things. We circulated briefly, accepting condolences from those who recognized us and introductions from those who didn't. The surreality of the situation wasn't lost on me, standing in Thomas's home, among his friends and colleagues, being treated as legitimate mourners when for 20 years we had been erased from his narrative. After about 45 minutes, Ethan caught my eye across the room and gave me a subtle nod. We'd agreed in advance to make our exit together, neither of us wanting to linger longer than necessary in this strange simulacrum of familial connection. As we retrieved our coats, Melissa found us, her expression relieved. "You're leaving? I don't blame you. This whole thing feels artificial?" I suggested. "Exactly." She hugged us both briefly. "Thank you for coming. It meant a lot to me, even if no one else here understands the significance." "Your eulogy was beautiful," Ethan told her sincerely. "And brave, given the audience." Melissa smiled wryly. Victoria was furious, but what could she say? It was all true. As we stepped into the elevator, Ethan let out a long breath, some of the tension visibly leaving his shoulders. "Well, that's done," he said quietly. "The official farewell to a father I barely knew." "How are you feeling?" I asked, studying his face for signs of distress. "Honestly, mostly relieved it's over," he admitted. "The funeral, the reception, all of it. It feels like we can finally close this chapter now." I nodded, understanding completely. The past few months had been an unexpected detour into territory we'd thought long ago left behind. Thomas's illness, the reconnection, his death. Now we could return to our lives, to the patterns and relationships we'd built without him. "What happens now?" I asked as we emerged onto the street, the spring afternoon bright and bustling around us, life continuing its relentless forward motion despite the somber event we'd just left. Ethan considered the question, his gaze thoughtful as he looked out at the city streaming past. "Now we keep building," he said simply. "Horizon, your practice with James, our lives. We keep moving forward the way we always have." He glanced at me, a small smile forming, but maybe with a little less weight, a little more clarity. I slipped my arm through his as we walked, struck anew by the wisdom and resilience of this remarkable young man I'd raised. "Thomas said something to me during my hospital visit," I recalled. He said that his success ultimately meant nothing compared to what he'd given up. At the time, I thought it was just convenient deathbed philosophy. "But," Ethan prompted, hearing the qualification in my tone, "but looking around that apartment today, seeing the emptiness of his life despite all the trappings of success." I shook my head. I think he was right. I think he finally understood what really matters. "Too late for him," Ethan noted softly, "but not too late for us to remember." We continued walking in comfortable silence, each absorbed in our own reflections. The chapter with Thomas was finally, definitively closed. What remained was the future we would continue to build together, mother and son, bound by love and shared experience rather than merely by biology. As we parted ways a few blocks later, Ethan heading to his loft to change before a dinner meeting, me returning home to James, I found myself grateful for the strange, circuitous path that had brought us to this point. Not grateful for the pain Thomas had caused, but for the strength and resilience it had forged in both of us. Not grateful for his absence, but for the close bond Ethan and I had developed because of it. Life rarely followed the narratives we constructed for it. Revenge fantasies remained unfulfilled, or transformed into something unrecognizable when finally realized. Justice took unexpected forms, and sometimes the greatest victory wasn't in seeing someone else fall, but in rising so high yourself that their absence became merely a footnote rather than the defining chapter of your story. 20 years ago, Thomas had walked out our door, saying those 5 devastating words, "Your son isn't mine." Now, with time's strange symmetry, those words had been proven doubly false. Ethan was unquestionably Thomas's biological son, a fact acknowledged before Thomas's death. But in all the ways that truly mattered, Ethan had never been Thomas's, had never embodied his values, priorities, or worldview. He had been mine, my son. My heart walking outside my body, my greatest achievement and deepest joy, and that, in the end, was all that really mattered. 1 year after Thomas's death, Ethan invited me to lunch at his favorite restaurant in Tribeca, his voice on the phone containing an undercurrent of excitement that piqued my curiosity. "What's the occasion?" I asked as we settled at our table, noting his barely suppressed energy. "Can't a son just want to have lunch with his favorite mother?" he teased, though his eyes held a sparkle that suggested there was indeed something specific to celebrate. Your only mother? I corrected with a smile. And of course you can. But you're practically vibrating with news, so you might as well tell me before you spontaneously combust. He laughed, conceding the point. All right, you caught me. I do have news. He paused dramatically. Horizon is acquiring Jensen Financial. I stared at him, momentarily speechless. The entire company? Not just a division? The whole thing, he confirmed, his satisfaction evident. The deal closes next week. It's been in the works for months, all very hush-hush until the final details were settled. But how? I asked, trying to wrap my mind around the scale of what he was describing. Jensen Financial was a major player in the investment world, far larger than Horizon despite my son's company's impressive growth over the past 3 years. Several factors aligned, Ethan explained, his expression turning more serious. After Thomas's death, Victoria pushed for aggressive expansion but without his strategic sense. They made some significant missteps, lost key clients. Their stock has been underperforming for months. He took a sip of water before continuing. Meanwhile, Horizon has been overperforming. Our ethical investment approach is attracting major institutional clients who want to align their money with their stated values. The sustainable finance division we acquired from Jensen 2 years ago has tripled in value under our management. So you're buying them out, I said, still processing the magnitude of this development. The company that Thomas built, that he prioritized over his family, is becoming a subsidiary of Horizon, yes, Ethan finished, watching my reaction carefully. Their board approached us, actually. Turns out our reputation for turning around struggling divisions while maintaining profitability has made us an attractive partner. I sat back in my chair, considering the full-circle nature of this scenario. Thomas had abandoned his family, denied his son for the sake of his career and Jensen Financial. Now that son was acquiring the very company Thomas had sacrificed everything for. How does it feel? I asked Ethan, genuinely curious about his emotional response to this development. Taking over Thomas's company? Ethan considered the question thoughtfully. Less vindictive than you might expect, he said finally. This isn't about revenge or proving something to Thomas. He's gone. This is a sound business decision that happens to have a certain, he searched for the right word, symmetry to it. I nodded, understanding. And Victoria? What happens to her in all this? She retains her shares, which will convert to Horizon stock, Ethan explained. But she loses her board seat and any operational control. It's purely a financial relationship going forward. He hesitated, then added with a small smile, though I will be the one delivering the news personally. There's a certain poetry to that, I suppose. I couldn't help but appreciate the irony. Victoria, who had been instrumental in Thomas's decision to leave us, would now have to cede control of her late husband's company to the son he had denied. It wasn't revenge exactly. Ethan was right that the acquisition made sound business sense regardless of the personal history, but it did feel like a form of cosmic justice. I'm proud of you, I told him sincerely. Not just for the business success, but for how you've handled everything. Thomas's illness and death, the complicated family dynamics, all of it. You've shown remarkable grace and maturity. Ethan's expression softened. I had a good example, he said simply. You never let bitterness define you, even when you had every right to be bitter. You built something positive instead of dwelling on the negative. I've tried to do the same. We shifted to other topics as our meal arrived. His recent foray into dating after focusing so intensely on Horizon's growth, my latest environmental case, James's consideration of semi-retirement to focus on teaching and mentoring young lawyers. The easy flow of our conversation, the deep connection that had sustained us through 2 decades of challenges, remained as strong as ever. As we finished our lunch, Ethan grew thoughtful again. I've been thinking about something Thomas said to me near the end, he said, absently tracing the rim of his water glass. He told me that his biggest regret wasn't just missing my childhood, but missing the opportunity to become the person he might have been if he'd made different choices. I nodded, encouraging him to continue. It stuck with me, Ethan admitted. This idea that our choices don't just affect what happens in our lives, but who we become. That by prioritizing status and wealth over relationships and integrity, Thomas didn't just lose us, he lost the better version of himself he might have been. That's profound, I acknowledged. And true, I think. It made me reflect on my own choices, Ethan continued. On what I'm building with Horizon, on how I want to live my life going forward. I don't want to wake up 20 years from now with that kind of regret. I don't think you need to worry about that, I told him warmly. You've always had a clear sense of what matters, of true north on your moral compass. Even as a child, you had an innate integrity that amazed me. Ethan smiled, a touch of vulnerability in his expression. Nature or nurture, do you think? The question held layers of meaning. Was he like this because of some inherent quality he'd been born with, possibly inherited from Thomas or me? Or was it the result of how I'd raised him, the values I'd instilled? Both, probably, I said thoughtfully. You came into this world with certain inherent qualities, but the choices I made as your mother, the environment we created together, helped shape how those qualities developed. I reached across the table to take his hand. What I know for certain is that you are entirely your own person, Ethan, not defined by Thomas's abandonment or even by my parenting. You've made yourself who you are through countless choices, large and small, guided by your own internal compass. His fingers tightened around mine briefly, acknowledging the emotional weight of the moment. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything. As we left the restaurant and prepared to head our separate ways, Ethan to Horizon's headquarters to prepare for the Jensen acquisition announcement, me to meet James for a gallery opening, I found myself reflecting on the long, strange journey that had brought us to this point. 20 years ago, standing in our kitchen as Thomas walked out, declaring that Ethan wasn't his son, I could never have imagined this outcome. Not just the material success or professional accomplishments, but the emotional wholeness, the sense of purpose and meaning that both Ethan and I had found despite, or perhaps partly because of, the challenges we had faced. Life rarely followed the narratives we constructed for it. Revenge fantasies remained unfulfilled or transformed into something unrecognizable when finally realized. Justice took unexpected forms, and sometimes the greatest victory wasn't in seeing someone else fall, but in rising so high yourself that their absence became merely a footnote rather than the defining chapter of your story. Your son isn't mine, Thomas had said before leaving. 20 years later, as I watched my brilliant, compassionate son stride confidently toward his future, a future that now encompassed the very company Thomas had sacrificed everything for, I knew with absolute certainty that those words had contained the most profound error of Thomas's life, an error that had cost him everything that truly mattered, while forging in Ethan and me a resilience and bond that no abandonment could ever break. Ethan had always been his son, biologically and undeniably, but in all the ways that truly counted, in character, in values, in the capacity for genuine connection and purposeful work, he had been mine, my son, my heart, my proudest achievement, and that was a truth that even death could not erase.